For most of human history, strength was never something people trained for. It was something that stayed with them, quietly, as long as life kept asking for it. The body did not become strong through effort alone, but through a world that never allowed stillness for too long. There were no methods, no routines, no conscious attempts to improve. And yet, across generations, humans maintained a kind of physical resilience that feels unfamiliar today. Not because they knew more, but because they lived in ways that we no longer do. In this journey, you will slowly uncover the overlooked patterns, habits, and ways of living that ancient humans followed, without naming them subtle things that may have kept their bodies capable over time. If those patterns have faded from our lives, then what exactly did humans used to do that kept them strong, and which of those forgotten ways might still be quietly waiting to be seen again? There is a quiet difference between a body that becomes strong on purpose and a body that simply never had the chance to become weak. And for most of human history, the second condition was far more common than the first. Not because people understood anything about strength in the way it is described today, but because the world around them did not offer many alternatives. And this difference begins not in muscles or bones, but in the relationship between the human body and its environment, where strength was never separated from survival and never treated as a goal that could be postponed or scheduled, because the earliest humans moved through landscapes that required constant adjustment, uneven ground, shifting weather, uncertain food sources, and long distances between moments of rest, and within that setting the body was not being trained in any deliberate sense. It was simply responding, adapting quietly to repeated demands that did not arrive as structured effort, but as small, continuous pressures spread across time. And this matters because the modern idea of strength often begins with intention, with a decision to improve, while the older pattern began with exposure, with a body placed inside conditions that made certain capabilities necessary without ever naming them. And when those conditions are removed, something subtle changes. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually, as the body begins to reorganize itself around a different set of expectations, fewer interruptions, more stable surfaces, predictable access to food, and long periods where movement is no longer required. And in that shift it becomes difficult to even recognize what has been lost, because there is no clear memory of what was once normal, no moment where strength disappears, only a slow fading of demands that once shaped the body without being noticed. And if we look back carefully, not to imagine a perfect past, but to observe patterns that are still visible in archaeology and in the structure of the human body itself, we begin to see that strength may have been less about effort and more about continuity, less about intensity and more about repetition without awareness. And this continuity can be traced to the earliest stages of human life, where movement began as a requirement for finding food, for following animal paths, for navigating terrain that did not accommodate stillness for long. And over many generations, these repeated actions shaped not only muscle, but coordination, balance, and the subtle timing between different parts of the body, forming a system that functioned without needing to be optimized or improved in the modern sense, because it was already aligned with the environment it existed within. And this alignment is easy to overlook today because the environments most people live in no longer require the same responses, and so strength becomes something separate, something that must be recreated artificially, often in short bursts of focused effort, rather than something that emerges quietly from the structure of daily life. And yet if we slow down and observe this difference without trying to resolve it too quickly, a question begins to take shape, not about how to become stronger, but about what kind of life makes strength unnecessary to think about in the first place, and whether the answer lies not in adding new actions, but in noticing the absence of old ones that once existed at the very beginning of what it meant to live as a human in a world that never paused. If strength once emerged without intention, then it becomes necessary to look more closely at the kind of world that made such a thing possible, because the human body does not create capability on its own. It responds to what surrounds it, and for a very long span of time that surrounding world was defined by a quiet instability, not chaos in a dramatic sense, but a constant variation that prevented the body from settling into stillness for too long. And this variation can be understood through simple patterns that repeat across many archaeological and ecological observations, where early humans moved through landscapes that offered no permanent arrangement of comfort, ground that shifted underfoot, paths that were not flat or predictable, and distances between places that could not be reduced or shortened. And within such conditions, movement was not something that needed to be encouraged. It was already embedded into the structure of each day, not as effort but as necessity that arrived in small increments. And what makes this important is not the scale of any single action but the continuity between them, because when movement is interrupted, even briefly, it tends to reorganize around rest. But when interruption is rare, the body begins to treat motion as its default state, not something that requires motivation, and this difference changes how strength is maintained over time, not through bursts of high demand but through the absence of long inactivity. And if we look at the earliest traces of human presence across different regions, we do not see evidence of structured exercise, but we do see repeated signs of travel, migration, and adaptation to terrain, which suggests that the body was consistently engaged in navigating space rather than resisting it. And this engagement was not uniform. Some days required more effort than others, some environments were harsher than others, but the underlying pattern remained. The body was rarely separated from the need to respond to its surroundings, and this constant relationship between body and environment formed a kind of quiet baseline, where strength was not something that increased or decreased dramatically, but something that was maintained through ongoing use. And when we compare this to the modern condition, the contrast becomes clearer, because the environments most people live in now are designed to reduce variation, to smooth out surfaces, to shorten distances, and to minimize the need for physical adjustment. And while this creates comfort and efficiency, it also removes many of the small demands that once kept the body engaged without conscious effort. And over time, the absence of these demands leads to a different kind of adaptation, where the body no longer expects to move in the same continuous way. And so strength becomes something that must be reintroduced deliberately, often in isolated moments rather than distributed across the day. And this separation between movement and living is subtle, but it marks a significant shift from the conditions that shaped the human body at its origin, where motion was not an activity but a background state, something that existed without being noticed. And if we follow this idea further, it suggests that what kept humans strong may not have been any specific action, but the simple fact that their world did not allow them to remain still for very long, and that this quiet pressure, repeated across days and generations, may have been enough to maintain a level of physical capability that did not need to be measured or improved, because it was never separated from the act of living itself, which began long ago in environments that required movement not as a choice, but as a condition of being human within them. If the body once remained strong without intention, then the final piece of this early pattern begins to reveal itself, not in what people did occasionally, but in what they rarely experienced, which was prolonged separation from movement, because the difference between past and present is not simply that earlier humans moved more, but that they were less often removed from the need to move for extended periods. And this absence of long stillness may have played a quiet but central role in maintaining physical capability over time, since the human body is shaped not only by action, but also by the length of inactivity it is allowed to enter. And when that inactivity becomes extended, the body begins to reorganize itself around conservation, reducing engagement, simplifying patterns of movement, and gradually shifting away from the continuous readiness that once defined it. And if we consider the environments that early humans lived within, even moments that might appear restful were often embedded within a larger context of readiness. Sitting close to the ground rather than supported by elevated structures, adjusting posture frequently rather than remaining fixed, rising and lowering the body multiple times throughout the day without formal repetition. And these small transitions, though easy to overlook, formed a kind of physical rhythm that did not rely on awareness. And this rhythm is important because it suggests that strength was not maintained through effort alone, but through the prevention of long disengagement, where the body was never fully removed from the possibility of needing to respond. And when we compare this to modern conditions, the contrast becomes clearer, not as a judgment, but as an observation of structure, where extended sitting, reduced need to change posture, and environments designed for stability allow the body to remain inactive for longer uninterrupted periods. And over time, this creates a different baseline, one where movement must be reintroduced deliberately rather than occurring naturally. And this reintroduction, often concentrated into short intervals, may not fully replicate the earlier pattern of continuous low-level demand, because the body responds differently to brief intensity than it does to long duration. And this distinction helps explain why strength today can feel temporary or difficult to maintain, as it is built within a structure that allows frequent disengagement rather than one that quietly prevents it. And if we return again to the origin of the human body, shaped over many generations within environments that required ongoing interaction with terrain, climate, and distance, we begin to see that what kept humans strong may have been less about what they added to their lives and more about what was never removed, which was the constant, low-level expectation that the body would remain engaged, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that prevented complete stillness from becoming the norm. And this idea does not lead to a simple conclusion, but it opens a space for a different kind of question, one that moves away from methods and toward patterns, asking whether strength is something that can be created in isolation, or whether it is more deeply connected to a way of living that once existed without being named, beginning from the earliest stages of human life, when the body and its environment were still closely aligned, and movement was not something that had to be remembered, because it was never allowed to be forgotten. There is a quiet shift that becomes visible when we move from understanding the human body to observing the world that shaped it. Because if strength once existed without deliberate effort, then the environment itself must have carried part of that responsibility, not by forcing intensity, but by quietly removing the possibility of remaining still for long. And this begins with a simple but often overlooked detail, that the natural environments early humans lived in were not designed for stability, not in the way modern spaces are. And this lack of stability did not appear as constant danger, but as a subtle unevenness that required the body to stay responsive, adjusting balance, altering posture, and distributing weight in small, repeated ways throughout the day. And these adjustments were not noticeable as effort, but they accumulated over time, forming a kind of background activity that never fully stopped. And if we look at the landscapes that early humans moved through, forests with irregular ground, open plains shaped by weather, river edges that changed with seasons, and paths that were not fixed but constantly shifting, we begin to see that the body was always interacting with something that could not be predicted with complete certainty. And this interaction required attention, but not in a conscious or exhausting way, rather in a quiet, ongoing sense of responsiveness that kept the body engaged, even in moments that might appear restful. And this matters because when the environment does not support long periods of passive stillness, the body does not need to create reasons to move. It simply continues moving as part of its normal state. And over many generations, this pattern becomes embedded, not as a learned behavior, but as a baseline expectation. And when that expectation is removed, when the environment becomes flat, stable, and predictable, something changes. Not immediately, but gradually, as the body begins to rely less on constant adjustment and more on support provided by the surroundings. And this shift reduces the number of small movements that once filled the day, movements that were never counted or recognized, but that played a role in maintaining coordination, balance, and low-level strength. And if we consider the earliest stages of human existence, when survival depended on navigating terrain that offered little assistance, it becomes clear that the body was rarely allowed to become passive for long, because even standing in one place required subtle engagement. And this stands in contrast to many modern environments, where standing, sitting, and moving often require less adaptation, as surfaces are even, distances are shortened, and tools reduce the need for physical interaction with the environment. And while these changes bring comfort and efficiency, they also alter the relationship between the body and the world, shifting it from one of continuous interaction to one of intermittent engagement, where movement becomes something that can be postponed, scheduled, or even avoided. And this difference may seem small at first, but over time it changes how the body maintains itself, because without the constant, low-level demands of an uneven and changing environment, the body no longer receives the same signals to stay engaged, and so strength begins to depend more on intentional action rather than continuous exposure, and this raises a quiet question that connects back to the beginning of human life, not about what specific actions were performed, but about what kind of world made those actions unavoidable, and whether the strength that once existed without effort was simply the natural outcome of living in a place where stillness was never fully supported, and where the body, from its earliest origins, remained in a state of gentle, continuous response to a world that never became completely still itself. A world that did not allow stillness was not only uneven beneath the feet, it was also spread out across distance, and distance may be one of the quietest forces in the history of human strength, because it does not look dramatic, it does not require a single heroic act, and it does not announce itself as training, yet it asks the body to repeat itself again and again, until movement becomes part of the body's ordinary language. And for early humans, this distance was woven into the search for food, water, shelter, fuel, raw material, and safe places to rest, not as a planned exercise, but as the shape of daily existence, where useful things were often separated from one another by ground that had to be crossed. And this crossing mattered because the human body did not evolve inside a world of immediate access. It evolved inside a world where reaching something usually required time, attention, and physical participation. And even when the effort was not extreme, it was persistent, returning each day in different forms, through walking, carrying, bending, waiting, turning, and moving again. And the important point is not that every ancient life was the same, because environments and cultures differed greatly, but that the broad human condition was marked by a closer connection between need and movement than most modern lives require, and this connection began very early in human history, when the body's long legs, upright posture, balance, breathing, and endurance were shaped within landscapes where distance could not be removed from survival, and in that setting strength was not something added after the day was done, it was quietly maintained by the day itself, because the day kept asking the body to travel through space, and when distance is part of ordinary life, the muscles, joints, tendons, lungs, and nervous system receive repeated signals to remain capable, not through sudden strain alone, but through constant use, at a level the body can sustain. And this may be why distance is so easy to underestimate, because it builds no obvious monument, leaves no single dramatic mark, and yet it forms a background pressure across generations, encouraging bodies that can keep going, adjust pace, recover while still moving, and carry small burdens without needing to separate those actions into categories. And here the contrast with modern life becomes clearer, because distance has not disappeared entirely, but it has often been compressed by roads, vehicles, elevators, stored food, piped water, artificial light, and organized rooms where many needs can be met without crossing much ground. And these changes are not failures, they are achievements that protect people from hardship. But they also mean the body no longer receives the same steady invitation to remain engaged. And when distance is reduced, the chain of small efforts that once connected one need to another is broken into shorter fragments, leaving movement to become optional, planned, or symbolic, rather than built into the path between hunger and food, thirst and water, cold and fuel, rest and shelter. And if we return to the earliest human starting point, the difference is not only physical but structural, because the old world made the body negotiate space before it could satisfy many needs, while the modern world often brings needs closer to the body, and this reversal changes what strength means, from a quality maintained by repeated contact with the world into something that must be protected against the convenience of not moving. And this does not mean the past was healthier or kinder, only that it placed the body inside a pattern where capability was used before it could be forgotten. And as we continue to follow this pattern, the question becomes less about one ancient trick and more about a lost arrangement between space and life, where the distance between things quietly kept the human body awake and steadily engaged. Beyond uneven ground and the quiet pressure of distance, there was another layer to this world that did not allow stillness, and it was time itself, not in the sense of schedules or measured hours, but in the way natural cycles shaped when movement happened and when it could not be avoided. Because early human life was not organized around fixed routines that could be repeated exactly each day, it was shaped by light and darkness, by shifting weather, by seasonal changes that altered the availability of food, water, and shelter. And within these cycles, the body was required to adapt continuously, not by following a plan, but by responding to conditions that were never fully stable, and this constant adjustment created a pattern where movement was not only frequent, but also varied, sometimes slower, sometimes more demanding, sometimes extended across longer periods. And this variation matters because the human body responds differently to a narrow range of repeated actions than it does to a broad range of changing ones. And when movement patterns vary, different muscles are engaged, different joints are used, and the coordination between them becomes more flexible, allowing the body to maintain a wider range of capability without needing to specialize too early or too narrowly. And if we look back to the earliest stages of human existence, this variability can be seen in the way people had to respond to changing landscapes, following animal migrations at certain times, adjusting routes as rivers rose or dried, altering daily rhythms as daylight shifted across seasons. And these changes did not arrive as choices. They arrived as conditions that required response. And in that response, the body was exposed to a mix of movements that did not repeat in exactly the same way each day, and this prevented the body from settling into a single pattern that could be performed efficiently but might limit adaptability, and instead encouraged a broader form of strength, one that could handle different types of demand without needing to prepare for each one separately. And when we compare this to modern environments, the difference becomes more visible, not as a fault, but as a transformation. Because many aspects of life are now stabilized, light can be extended beyond sunset, temperature can be controlled, food can be stored and accessed at predictable times, and daily routines can be repeated with little variation. And while this stability brings safety and convenience, it also reduces the range of conditions the body must respond to, and over time this can narrow the variety of movements that occur naturally, leaving the body to operate within a smaller set of patterns. And when variation decreases, strength may become more specific, more dependent on chosen activities rather than emerging from a wide range of demands. And this is where the earlier world reveals another quiet influence, that it did not simply require movement, it required different kinds of movement across time, and this difference may have helped maintain a form of physical resilience that was less about excelling in one area and more about remaining capable across many. And as we return again to the origin of human life, we see a body shaped not only by constant use, but by changing conditions that prevented it from becoming too fixed. And within that changing world, stillness was not only limited by space and distance, but also by time itself, which continued to move, shift and reshape the demands placed on the body, ensuring that engagement was not only continuous, but also varied in ways that are less common in the structured rhythms of modern life. Walking may be the most ordinary human movement, and for that reason it is easy to forget how deeply it belongs to the beginning of our story, because before strength was measured, named, or separated into exercises, the human body was already organized around the simple act of moving across the ground, step after step, often for reasons that had nothing to do with improvement and everything to do with reaching what life required. And this is where the question of ancient strength begins to narrow into something more specific, since walking was not just one activity among many, but a basic condition that connected food, water, shelter, social contact, and memory of place, allowing the body to remain engaged through repetition that did not feel separate from living. And when we observe the human form itself, the long legs, upright balance, spring-like tendons, coordinated arms, rotating trunk, and ability to breathe while moving for long periods, we are not looking at a body built only for sudden force, but at a body shaped for sustained travel. And this kind of travel did not need to be intense in every moment to matter, because its power came from duration, recurrence, and the way it quietly placed many systems of the body into use at the same time. And in early human environments, walking often formed the thread between one task and the next, not as a chosen practice, but as the space between needs, the slow path from a camp to water, from a familiar tree line to open ground, from a known shelter to a place where food might be found. And although we should not pretend that every group lived in the same way, or that every day required the same amount of movement, it is widely accepted that human life for most of our species' history involved far more direct contact with distance than many modern lives do. And this matters because walking is not only movement of the legs, it is also balance over changing ground, gentle loading through the bones, rhythm through the spine and hips, coordination between vision and footing, and a steady exchange between effort and recovery, all occurring without the body needing to be pushed to extremes. And when such movement appears again and again across the day, it can maintain capacity in a way that is quiet, distributed, and hard to notice, much like breathing. And perhaps this is why the loss of ordinary walking can feel so invisible, because nothing dramatic disappears at once. Only the background thread that once tied human needs to human motion becomes shorter, softer, and easier to avoid, and in modern life walking is often treated as an optional activity, something counted, scheduled, or performed after long periods of sitting. But in the older pattern, it was not optional in the same way, because the world placed useful things apart from one another and the body had to cross the space between them, and that crossing kept muscles active, joints familiar with range, balance responsive, and endurance present without becoming a special project. And if we connect this back to the earliest human starting point, we can see that walking was not a method invented by ancient people, nor a secret routine passed down through intention, but a condition built into the relationship between a mobile body and a spread-out world. And this is why it belongs near the center of the question, what humans used to do that kept them strong, because they moved not only when they chose to move, but because their lives were arranged so that movement was the bridge between almost everything, and through that bridge the body received small, repeated reminders of what it was still expected to do, not loudly, not heroically, but steadily, in the slow rhythm of feet meeting the earth and carrying a human life forward. The strength that came from walking did not come only from the number of steps, but from the kind of walking the older human body had to perform. Because a foot moving across living ground is not the same as a foot moving across a smooth floor, and this difference is easy to miss, until we slow down and imagine the body as a system of small corrections, each step asking the ankle, knee, hip, spine, eyes, and inner ear to cooperate with a surface that never repeats itself exactly. And in early human environments, this cooperation was not rare. It was part of ordinary movement, as people crossed soil, sand, stones, roots, slopes, wet river edges, dry open ground, and narrow passages shaped by weather and use. And each surface asked for a slightly different answer from the body, not enough to feel like training, but enough to keep balance, coordination, and joint awareness alive. And this is why walking as an ancient pattern cannot be reduced to distance alone, because distance gave duration, but terrain gave variety, and together they created a quiet demand that modern flatness often removes. And if we look back toward the human starting point, the upright body was not simply designed to go forward, it was shaped to remain stable while moving through uncertainty, to place one foot before the other while reading the ground, to shift weight quickly when a stone turned, to shorten a step on a slope, to widen stance on soft earth, to bend slightly under a load, and then continue without making any of these movements into a separate task. And over many generations, this kind of walking may have maintained strength in a broader sense, not only through the large muscles that carry the body, but through the smaller stabilizing muscles that help the body remain organized. And these smaller demands are important because they rarely announce themselves, yet they influence how a person stands, turns, rises, avoids falling, and carries weight. And when they disappear from daily life, the loss can be difficult to identify, because the body may still move, but through a narrower and more predictable range. And here the modern contrast becomes quiet but clear, as many daily paths now pass through straight corridors, level floors, paved roads, vehicles, elevators, and rooms arranged to reduce physical adjustment, and such spaces are useful and protective, especially for safety, age, and comfort. But they also mean that much of the ordinary negotiation between body and ground has been softened, and when the ground stops asking questions, the body receives fewer chances to answer. So walking can become a repeated forward motion rather than a changing conversation with place. And this does not mean that the past should be romanticized, because uneven landscapes also brought fatigue, injury, and risk. But it does show why older forms of movement carried physical effects that were not consciously planned, and why the methods or tips of ancient life were often not methods at all, but conditions that required the whole body to participate, from the soles of the feet to the muscles around the spine, through countless quiet corrections that left almost no visible trace. And if someone asks what humans used to do that kept them strong, One answer is that they walked through worlds that did not let walking become too simple, and the strength came partly from the fact that every path carried small variations that asked the body to stay awake, not mentally alert in a dramatic sense, but physically responsive in the quiet language of posture, balance, and rhythm. And this returns us again to the beginning of human movement, where the body and ground were not separated by layers of design, and where every journey, even a modest one, could remind the body of its older relationship with earth, weight, direction, and the need to keep adjusting while moving onward. Walking also kept humans strong because it carried more than the body itself, and this is where the quiet usefulness of ordinary movement becomes clearer, because in older human settings, a person rarely moved through the world as an empty figure crossing a flat space, but often moved with something held, gathered, carried, balanced, or protected, and even when the load was small, it changed the meaning of each step, asking the shoulders, hands, back, hips, and breathing to cooperate with the legs in a way that simple movement alone does not require, and this made walking a whole body condition rather than only a movement of the feet, and it helps explain why strength in the older pattern did not need to be separated into categories, because endurance, balance, grip, posture, and carrying capacity often appeared together inside the same ordinary journey, not as a planned sequence, but as a response to need. And if we return to the early human starting point, the connection between movement and carrying becomes difficult to separate, since food had to be brought back, water had to be moved, tools or raw materials had to be transported, children and belongings sometimes had to be supported, and useful objects were rarely found exactly where they would be used. So the body became the bridge not only across distance, but between places of finding and places of keeping, and this bridge asked for repeated, moderate effort across time, the kind that does not feel dramatic in a single moment, yet slowly reminds the body that strength is not only the ability to move, but the ability to move while managing weight. And this is important because carrying changes posture, it changes stride, it changes how the trunk stabilizes the body. It asks the hands to hold, the arms to adjust, the shoulders to resist fatigue, and the legs to maintain rhythm under added demand. And when this happens often enough, without being named as exercise, the body is kept in a state of practical capability, shaped by tasks that have clear reasons outside the body itself. And this may be one of the forgotten patterns hidden inside the title question, because humans were not simply walking more, they were often walking with purpose attached to weight. And purpose made movement harder to avoid, since the object carried was connected to warmth, food, safety, shelter, or care for others, and in that setting strength was quietly preserved through responsibility, not motivation, through the plain fact that something needed to be moved from one place to another. And when we look at modern life, this connection is often weakened, because water arrives through pipes, food arrives packaged or delivered, fuel is stored elsewhere, tools are lighter, containers are designed for ease, and many heavy tasks are transferred to machines. And these changes are valuable, especially because they reduce injury and hardship. Yet they also remove many small moments when the body once had to coordinate walking with load. And when those moments disappear, the body may still travel, but it travels less often as a carrier, less often as the living connection between need and place. And this changes the background signals that maintain strength. Because carrying is not only about muscle size, it is about integration, the way grip, balance, breathing, and posture remain linked while the body moves through space. And if we follow this idea carefully, without turning it into advice or pretending the past was ideal, we can see that one of the ancient patterns was a life in which the body was repeatedly asked to be useful in practical ways, not to perform, not to impress, and not to improve for its own sake, but to move what life required across a world where distance, weight, and uneven ground still belong together, and this completes the first view of walking as a foundation of strength, because walking was not only forward motion, it was travel, adjustment, carrying, returning, and beginning again, a slow and repeated conversation between the human body and the material world from which it first emerged. There is a subtle difference between effort that is gathered into a single moment and effort that is spread quietly across an entire day, And this difference begins to explain another layer of how humans once remained strong without needing to think about it, because the older pattern of life did not separate physical demand into a defined period of activity followed by long inactivity, but allowed small amounts of effort to appear again and again in ways that were easy to overlook. And when these small demands are repeated without long interruption, they create a kind of continuity that the body responds to in a different way than it does to short, concentrated effort. And this can be seen if we return to the earliest human environments, where tasks were rarely completed in a single, isolated burst, but unfolded over time, requiring movement to begin, pause, shift direction, resume, and end without clear boundaries between one action and the next. And within this flow, the body was not asked to perform at maximum intensity, but it was also not given long periods of complete rest, and so it remained gently engaged, maintaining posture, balance, coordination, and low-level strength across many hours. And this matters because the human body adapts not only to how hard it is pushed, but also to how often it is used. And when use is frequent and distributed, the body maintains readiness without needing to rebuild it each time. And this pattern may have been one of the quiet conditions that kept strength present in earlier human life. Since effort was not something that had to be remembered or scheduled, it was already embedded in the structure of daily tasks. And if we look at archaeological and ethnographic observations without assuming exact routines, we often see evidence of repeated, moderate activities: gathering, preparing materials, tending to small tasks, adjusting tools, moving between locations, and these actions do not appear as training, yet they require the body to remain active in small ways that accumulate over time. And this accumulation is important because it creates a different relationship between effort and recovery, where the body is not pushed to exhaustion and then allowed to become inactive, but is instead kept within a range where it can continue functioning without needing long recovery periods. And when we compare this to modern patterns, the contrast becomes clearer, because many forms of physical effort are now concentrated into short sessions, often separated from the rest of the day by long periods of sitting or reduced movement. And while such sessions can be effective for specific goals, they may not recreate the older pattern of continuous low-level demand, and as a result, the body experiences a cycle of activation and deactivation, rather than a steady background of engagement, and over time this can change how strength is maintained, making it more dependent on repeated intentional effort rather than sustained use. And this difference is not immediately visible, because both patterns involve movement, but the structure surrounding that movement is different. One spreads effort across time, the other gathers it into moments. And if we return again to the beginning of human life, where survival depended on responding to many small needs rather than completing a single large task, it becomes easier to see why the body may have remained capable without needing to separate strength from living, because effort was not something added to the day. It was part of the day itself, appearing in small, continuous forms that did not require attention. And this suggests that one of the things humans used to do that kept them strong was not a specific action at all, but a pattern of distributing effort so widely across time that it never needed to be named or managed. And within that pattern, the body was quietly reminded, again and again, of what it was still expected to do, not through intensity, but through presence that did not fully fade. The effort that was spread across the day also carried another quality that is easy to miss, because it was usually tied to practical tasks rather than abstract improvement. And this gave movement a different place in human life, not as something performed for the body alone, but as something the body entered because the world required a result: a fire kept alive, food made usable, a shelter repaired, a tool shaped, water brought closer, a path crossed again. And each of these tasks may have looked small from the outside, yet each one placed the body into a chain of positions and pressures that could not be reduced to a single motion. And this is important because practical effort tends to mix many kinds of movement together: bending, reaching, squatting, standing, gripping, turning, carrying, and balancing, often in soft repetition. And the older human body did not need to isolate these movements in order to benefit from them, because they belong naturally to the task itself. And if we return to the earliest human conditions, where useful objects were not always light, surfaces were not always stable, and resources were not always close, The day itself became a field of small physical negotiations, each one asking the body to remain useful in a slightly different way, and over time this could maintain strength not as a separate achievement, but as a quiet side effect of doing what life required. And this is where the idea of ancient methods or forgotten tips must be handled carefully, because ancient people were not necessarily following methods in the modern sense, and we should not imagine them as secretly practicing routines. Yet the pattern of their lives contained repeated lessons that the body understood without words, that strength is preserved when movement is tied to meaning, when effort has a destination, when the hands and feet are not acting only to become stronger, but to complete something that matters outside the body. And this connection may have made movement more consistent, because it was supported by necessity rather than motivation. And necessity returns even when motivation does not. And in the archaeological record, while we cannot see every ordinary gesture, we can see traces of material life that imply repeated bodily work: stone tools shaped by hand, hearths tended, shelters or living surfaces arranged, animal remains processed, plant materials gathered, and objects transported across landscapes. And these traces do not prove one exact daily routine, but they do remind us that early human life was filled with tasks where the body interacted directly with matter, and that interaction asked for pressure, patience, coordination, and repeated moderate force. And when we place this beside many modern settings, the shift becomes quiet but significant. Because practical effort is often reduced or outsourced, food is already processed, water is delivered, heat is controlled, materials are manufactured, tools are designed to reduce strain, and many tasks can be completed by pressing, selecting, or weighting rather than lifting, shaping, carrying, or adjusting. And this reduction is not a failure. It is part of safety and civilization, but it changes the physical meaning of the day because the body is less often required to solve practical problems through movement. And when fewer practical problems require the body, fewer small opportunities remain for strength to be maintained without thought. And this brings us back to the origin of the human body. Not as a body designed for performance alone, but as a body that evolved inside a material world, where wood, stone, soil, water, animal remains, plant fibers, cold air, and uneven ground all asked for contact, resistance, and adjustment. And within that contact, strength was continually used before it became a separate concern. And perhaps this is why distributed effort mattered so much, because it did not arrive as a lesson, but as ordinary usefulness repeated across time, allowing the body to remain capable through tasks that were humble, necessary, and almost invisible. The older pattern of effort was not only spread across the day, it was also interrupted in a way that kept the body from becoming fixed, because practical life rarely moves in clean lines, and this irregular rhythm may have mattered as much as the effort itself. Since the body was asked to begin, stop, lower, rise, turn, wait, listen, carry, release, and begin again, not according to a planned sequence, but according to the changing shape of the task and the place where it happened, and this created a form of strength that was less like a peak and more like a steady background, a readiness that could return after each pause without needing to be summoned. And if we look back toward the early human starting point, this kind of interrupted effort seems deeply connected to life in open environments, wooded edges, river margins, rocky ground, and temporary living spaces, where tasks were not separated from terrain, weather, light, and the presence of other people, and the body had to respond to all of these at once, not by performing one perfect movement, but by adapting through many small changes. And this is important because strength is not only the ability to produce force, it is also the ability to organize the body under changing demands, to use just enough effort, to shift weight, to recover while still remaining ready, and to continue after a pause without losing the thread of movement. And in older human life, this thread was often maintained by necessity, because gathering materials, preparing food, tending fire, shaping objects, moving shelter, or following a route could require repeated effort across hours, with no clear border between work and rest, and this blurred border prevented the body from experiencing the day as one long block of stillness, interrupted by one short block of exertion, and instead placed it inside a rhythm of frequent re-entry, where the body kept returning to motion in small but meaningful ways. And this repeated return may be one of the quietest ancient patterns behind human strength, because it made capability ordinary, not exceptional. And when capability is ordinary, it does not need to announce itself. It simply remains available, and here the modern contrast becomes gentle but clear, because many present-day environments separate effort into defined moments. One period for work, one period for exercise, one period for rest. While much of the remaining time may involve sitting, riding, watching, or working with the hands but not the whole body, and this arrangement can make movement feel like an event rather than a condition. Something entered and exited, rather than something lightly woven through the day, and when movement becomes an event, the body may wait for permission to be used, while in older settings the body was often called upon before permission was ever considered. And this difference brings us back again to the beginning of human life, where there was no special category for keeping the body strong, because the body was already inside a world of distributed demands, small weights, changing postures, repeated crossings, useful tasks, and returning movements, and none of these should be romanticized, because they could be tiring, uncertain, and sometimes dangerous, yet they formed a structure in which strength was constantly touched, like an object handled every day until it remained familiar. And perhaps the forgotten lesson is not that humans once worked harder in every moment, but that their effort was woven so widely into living that the body was rarely left unused for long enough to forget its own practical language. And this closes the thought of effort spread across the day by showing that strength was maintained not through one great demand, but through many quiet returns to use repeated from the earliest human landscapes into the ordinary gestures of survival, where life itself kept calling the body back into motion before stillness could become complete. Carrying may be one of the most easily forgotten foundations of human strength, because it belongs to ordinary life so completely that it rarely appears important until it disappears. And yet for much of human history, the body was not only required to move itself through space, it was also required to move useful things with it. And this changed the meaning of strength in a quiet but powerful way. Since carrying joins movement, balance, grip, posture, breath, and purpose into a single act, not as an exercise, not as a performance, but as a practical answer to the simple fact that something needed to be taken from one place to another. And if we return to the early human starting point, this pattern becomes difficult to separate from survival itself, because food did not arrive prepared beside the resting place, water did not come through a pipe, fuel did not gather itself, raw material did not become tools without being found and moved, and objects that mattered often had to be held, tied, dragged, lifted, balanced, or carried across ground that was rarely flat. And this meant the body was repeatedly asked to manage weight while still travelling, not only in moments of heavy strain, but in small, moderate tasks that returned many times. And over time, those repeated tasks could maintain a broad kind of strength that was practical rather than specialized. Because carrying is never only one muscle working alone. It asks the hands to close, the shoulders to stabilize, the back to organize, the hips to adjust, and the legs to keep rhythm under a changing load. And when this happens in daily life, the body receives a steady reminder that strength exists to connect need with action. And this is an important difference from many modern forms of strength, where weight is often lifted in a place designed for lifting, separated from distance, weather, ground, and immediate necessity, while older carrying was usually tied to a wider situation, a path, a return, a group, a fire, a shelter, a meal, or a child. And because the reason for movement existed outside the body, the effort had a natural place in the day, making it less dependent on decision and more dependent on responsibility. And this may be one of the ancient patterns that people still sense without fully naming it, that a body remains capable when it is regularly useful, when it must hold and move real things, when strength is not displayed but spent carefully on ordinary needs. And archaeology cannot show every carrying gesture, yet it can show the material world that made carrying likely, stones moved away from their sources, tools transported across landscapes, remains gathered into living areas, hearths placed where fuel had to be brought, and shelters or camps that imply repeated handling of objects. And these traces do not allow us to claim one exact routine, but they do support the broader truth that human life involved direct physical contact with materials and places, and this contact made carrying a normal part of existence. And when we compare that with modern life, the contrast is gentle but clear, because many loads are now reduced. Wheels carry what arms once held, vehicles cross what legs once crossed, pipes carry water, machines move materials, and packaging makes objects easier to handle, and these changes have protected people from exhaustion and injury. But they have also removed many small moments when the body once had to coordinate weight with movement, and when those moments vanish, strength can become something detached from usefulness, something that must be recreated intentionally rather than maintained by the ordinary movement of life. And this does not mean the past was better, only that the past placed the body in a closer relationship with weight, distance, and need. And in that relationship, carrying quietly taught the body to remain integrated. From the hand around an object to the foot finding balance on the ground, from the first human landscapes to the long history of bodies that stayed strong because they were constantly asked to carry what life required. The strength created by carrying did not come only from heavy loads, because many of the most important effects may have come from repeated uneven loads, the kind that changed shape, shifted position, or had to be held in different ways as the body moved, and this matters because a balanced object carried for a short time on a smooth surface is not the same as a bundle of gathered material, a container of water, a tool, a piece of wood, or food taken across uneven ground, where the body must keep making small corrections while the load keeps asking new questions. And in older human life, these corrections were not treated as special movements. Yet they brought the whole body into cooperation, the fingers adjusting pressure, the wrist finding angle, the shoulders resisting tilt, the ribs and trunk staying organized, the hips shifting under weight, and the feet reading the ground step by step. And if we return to the early human starting point, this kind of practical load makes sense, because useful things in nature rarely present themselves in perfect shapes, equal weights, or convenient handles. And so the body had to learn through repetition how to manage awkwardness, not as a lesson but as a daily condition, and this may have preserved a form of strength that was less about lifting the greatest possible weight and more about remaining capable while handling objects that were imperfect, changing, and tied to real needs. And the difference is important because awkward weight trains attention through the body, not only force, since a shifting load can pull the spine out of line, disturb balance, shorten the breath, or change the rhythm of walking, and the body must answer without stopping every time. And over many generations, this repeated answering may have helped keep strength connected to coordination, endurance, and posture, rather than separating them into isolated abilities. And although archaeology cannot preserve most soft materials or every ordinary act of carrying, it does preserve enough traces of transported stone, work tools, gathered remains, hearth areas, and repeated settlement surfaces to remind us that human groups lived within material systems that required objects to be moved, stored, used, and moved again, and behind those traces were countless physical gestures that left no direct mark, but made the body part of the movement of things. And in that sense, one forgotten ancient pattern was not merely lifting, but managing the imperfect weight of the world. And when we compare this with many modern settings, we see how often awkwardness has been removed for good reasons. Handles are designed for comfort, wheels reduce carrying, packaging standardizes weight, machines lift and transport, surfaces are flattened, and objects are brought closer to where they are needed, and these improvements reduce harm and make life easier, especially for people who are old, injured, or tired. But they also reduce the small daily negotiations that once asked the body to remain coordinated under load. And when those negotiations disappear, strength may become simpler, more narrow, and more dependent on chosen practice, because the body is no longer asked as often to solve the old problem of moving an uneven thing through an uneven world. And this returns us to the central question with more precision, because humans were kept strong not only by carrying weight, but by carrying weight that belonged to life, weight that was irregular, meaningful, and connected to distance. And this kind of carrying did not make the body stronger through one dramatic strain, but through many quiet adjustments repeated across time, from the first environments where human hands gathered and held what the ground offered, to the long, ordinary history of people whose strength survived because the world kept placing useful, imperfect things into their arms. Carrying also reveals something deeper about ancient strength, because it shows that the body was often strengthened through responsibility rather than ambition. And this is a very different relationship with effort, since a load carried for a reason belongs to a wider world of need, care, memory, and return, not to the body alone. And in earlier human life, this meant that strength was continually tied to things that mattered outside the self. A gathered food source, a container of water, a child held close, a useful stone, dry wood for fire, plant material for shelter, or a tool that had to be kept and brought back again. And each of these objects placed the body into contact with weight, but also with purpose. And purpose changed the texture of the effort, because the body was not moving weight only to become stronger, it was moving weight because life depended on the object reaching another place. And this older pattern helps explain why strength could remain present without being named, because carrying was repeated through necessity, and necessity returns in ways that intention does not always return, especially in environments where useful materials were scattered, paths were uncertain, and the distance between finding and using could not simply be erased. And if we look again toward the early human starting point, the body appears not as a machine built for isolated force, but as a living bridge between a landscape and a group, between what was found and what could be used, between the outside world and the small circle of shelter, fire, food, and social life. And this bridge required more than strong muscles. It required judgment of weight, pacing, balance, breath, grip, and awareness of others, because carrying in human life was often shared, exchanged, delayed, or adjusted according to who could hold what and where it needed to go. And this social layer matters because strength was not only individual, it was woven into the survival of a group, where bodies of different ages and abilities likely contributed in different ways. And while we should not invent exact scenes beyond the evidence, it is reasonable to say that human life has long depended on cooperation around material tasks, and those tasks repeatedly placed the body in useful motion. And when carrying was shared, the meaning of strength became even less like performance, because the point was not to display power, but to keep a practical chain intact, moving water toward thirst, fuel toward fire, food toward hunger, shelter material toward protection, and tools toward future use. And in that chain, the body remained active because it had a place inside the needs of others. And this is a quiet difference from many modern conditions, where objects often arrive already moved, already processed, already placed within reach, and the body is spared not only the burden but also the recurring experience of being necessary to the movement of things. And this convenience is humane in many ways, especially when it protects people from exhaustion, pain, and unnecessary danger. But it also weakens the old connection between usefulness and physical capability, because when fewer needs pass through the body, fewer chances remain for strength to be maintained without deliberate effort, and carrying becomes something unusual, inconvenient, or optional, rather than a normal part of how the world is organized. And this does not suggest a return to hardship, nor does it turn ancient life into a model to copy, but it helps us see one of the forgotten patterns inside the title question, that humans used to keep strength alive by repeatedly moving meaningful weight through real space, often with others in mind. And this kind of movement joined body, environment, and social life into one continuous system, beginning from the earliest landscapes where human hands gathered what the world offered and human bodies carried it toward use. And within that simple act, repeated across generations, strength remained close to purpose, close to the ground, and close to the shared work of staying alive. The ground may be one of the most overlooked forces in the history of human strength, because it was always there, silent beneath the body, shaping movement not through command but through contact. And for most of human existence, the body lived much closer to it than many people do now, not only walking across it, but sitting on it, rising from it, sleeping near it, kneeling beside it, leaning toward it, and lowering itself again and again into positions that required strength without being recognized as strength. And this closeness matters because a body that regularly meets the ground is asked to organize itself differently from a body that is constantly supported by elevated seats, soft beds, smooth floors, and fixed furniture. since every descent and every return to standing requires coordination between the feet, ankles, knees, hips, spine, shoulders, and hands. And these movements do not need to be intense to matter, because their value lies in repetition, range, and the quiet reminder that the body must still be able to change levels. And if we return to the early human starting point, the ground was not a surface separate from life. It was the basic plane on which food was prepared, tools were shaped, fires were tended, children were cared for, objects were repaired, and rest was taken. And this meant that daily living repeatedly brought the body downward and upward, asking it to fold, balance, support weight, and rise again without turning any of these actions into formal practice. And this is one reason the ground belongs directly to the question of what kept humans strong, because it created a world where the body could not remain at one comfortable height all day. And when the body changes height often, it uses capacities that modern furniture can quietly remove from ordinary life, not because furniture is harmful in itself, but because support reduces the need for the body to support itself. And over time, what is not asked for is used less often, and what is used less often can become less familiar. And this fading is subtle because nothing dramatic happens at once. A person simply rises from the ground less, squats less, kneels less, balances less, reaches from lower positions less, and gradually the body's relationship with its own full range becomes narrower. While in older settings, especially before the spread of chairs and raised beds in many societies, contact with the ground remained woven into ordinary tasks, and although cultures differed greatly in posture, shelter, and material life, the broad pattern is clear enough to observe that the human body has long been capable of resting and working close to the earth in ways that require mobility and strength together. And archaeology cannot record every posture, but it can show living floors, hearths, tool-making areas, sleeping surfaces, and traces of work done at ground level, reminding us that much of human life unfolded near the surface of the earth, where the body had to arrange itself without constant artificial support. And when we compare this with modern spaces, the contrast is not a simple moral judgment, because chairs, beds, and raised work surfaces have brought comfort, hygiene, safety, and dignity, especially for tired, injured, elderly, or ill bodies. But they also change the daily conversation between body and ground, making certain movements rarer, and when those movements become rare, strength becomes easier to separate from living, because the body no longer receives the same ordinary requests to lower, fold, brace, and rise. And this returns us again to the first human landscapes, where the ground was not an obstacle but a constant companion, shaping posture, balance, and practical strength through countless small contacts. And perhaps one forgotten thing humans used to do was simply live near the ground, not as a technique, not as a chosen method, but as a condition that kept the body in touch with its own depth, its own weight, and its quiet ability to come back up from below. Living close to the ground also meant that the body was rarely held in a single fixed posture for very long. And this is where another quiet layer of strength begins to appear, because when there is no stable chair, no uniform surface, and no single position designed to be maintained without effort, the body must keep making small adjustments even while resting, shifting weight from one side to another, changing the angle of the hips, repositioning the legs, leaning forward, leaning back, supporting itself with one hand and then the other. And these adjustments are so small that they often pass without notice, yet they keep the muscles, joints, and balance systems lightly engaged, preventing the body from fully settling into passivity. And if we return again to the early human starting point, this kind of continuous repositioning makes sense, because the ground was not only uneven, it was also firm, textured, and responsive to pressure in ways that encouraged movement rather than stillness. And this meant that even moments of rest carried a subtle form of activity, not enough to be tiring, but enough to maintain a quiet awareness of the body's position in space. And over time, this awareness may have helped preserve coordination and stability, since the body was repeatedly asked to organize itself without external support. And this is important because strength is not only the ability to generate force, it is also the ability to remain organized when not moving, to hold posture without collapse, to adjust balance without delay, and to respond to small changes before they become larger problems. And in older human environments, these abilities were used regularly, not because people intended to train them, but because the ground did not offer a way to avoid them. and this created a condition where even stillness contained movement, where rest was not the absence of engagement, but a softer form of it. And when we compare this to many modern environments, the difference becomes gentle but clear, because chairs, cushions, and designed seating allow the body to remain in one position with minimal effort, supporting the back, stabilizing the hips, reducing the need for constant adjustment, and this support is valuable, especially for comfort, recovery, and reducing strain, but it also reduces the frequency of those small, almost invisible movements that once kept the body responsive. And when those movements become less common, the body may begin to rely more on external support than on its own ability to maintain posture. And this shift does not happen suddenly, it unfolds slowly, as the range of positions used in daily life becomes narrower, and the transitions between them become less frequent. And this narrowing can make strength feel more like something that appears only during intentional activity, rather than something that is quietly present even during rest. And if we connect this back to the origin of human life, we can see that the ground did more than support the body, it asked the body to support itself, and in doing so it maintained a kind of low-level engagement that did not need to be named or measured. And perhaps this is one of the forgotten patterns hidden within the simple idea of sitting, that humans once sat in ways that did not allow complete stillness, and that this gentle, continuous shifting may have been enough to keep parts of the body awake that are now often allowed to sleep for long periods. And through that quiet wakefulness, strength remained not as a visible effort, but as a background condition shaped by contact with the earth and the need to remain balanced within it. The ground shaped strength not only through sitting and rising, but through the simple fact that it made the body remember its own weight. Because every time a person lowered down, balanced near the earth, reached from a low position, slept close to a firm surface, or returned to standing, the body had to negotiate gravity without much assistance. And this negotiation is one of the oldest conversations in human life, older than furniture, older than built floors, older than the idea that comfort should lift the body away from the surface beneath it. And if we return to the early human starting point, the body was not held by design supports through most of the day. It was held by its own arrangement of bones, joints, muscles, breath, and balance. And this meant that strength was maintained through ordinary contact with gravity, not in dramatic moments, but in repeated transitions that asked the body to fold, brace, press, extend, and rise. And these transitions mattered because they joined mobility and strength together. So the body did not simply become strong in one position, it stayed familiar with changing position, and this familiarity may be one of the quiet losses of modern comfort, because when beds are high, chairs are stable, floors are smooth, and work surfaces are fixed at convenient heights, the body is spared many small struggles that once occurred naturally, and that sparing is often useful, especially for safety and relief, but it also means the body is asked less often to move through its full depth, from upright posture down toward the ground and back again. And over time, the rarest movements can begin to feel difficult, not because the body has failed, but because the environment has stopped requesting them. And archaeology reminds us that many older living spaces were organized around low surfaces, hearths, working areas, sleeping places, and activity zones close to the earth, where human hands shaped tools, prepared materials, handled food, and arranged objects from positions that required the whole body to participate. Though we should not pretend to know every posture or every routine with certainty, and this is important because the strength created by the ground was never only about the legs, it involved the hips opening and closing, the spine stabilizing, the hands assisting, the feet finding pressure, and the nervous system judging where the body was in relation to the surface below. And when such actions happened many times across a life, they formed a practical intelligence of movement, a kind of bodily knowledge that did not need words, and this knowledge was connected directly to the beginning of human existence, when surviving meant remaining capable in a world that did not cushion every descent or simplify every rise. And yet this should not be misunderstood as a claim that older lives were healthier in every way, because hard ground could also bring discomfort, cold, injury, and exhaustion, and many forms of modern support are humane responses to real human limits. But the historical point remains calm and clear, that by lifting daily life away from the ground, human societies also lifted away many ordinary chances to use the body's natural range, and when those chances disappeared, strength became more separate from rest, more separate from work, and more dependent on intentional moments of use. And so the ground teaches a careful lesson inside the larger question. Not that people should copy the past, but that ancient strength often came from conditions that made the body participate more fully in ordinary living. And among those conditions, living near the ground quietly kept humans familiar with lowering, rising, balancing, reaching, and holding themselves against gravity until strength was not something added to life, but something renewed each time the body met the earth and came back up again. A life that does not follow a fixed routine creates a different kind of strength, one that is shaped not by repetition of the same movement, but by the need to respond to changing conditions. And this difference becomes clearer when we consider how irregular early human life may have been, not chaotic in a dramatic sense, but fluid, influenced by weather, daylight, the availability of food, the movement of animals, the presence of water, and the needs of a group that could not always plan far ahead. And within this fluid structure, the body was rarely asked to perform the same pattern in exactly the same way each day, because the day itself was not fixed, and this matters because the human body adapts very specifically to what it repeats. And when repetition is narrow, strength can become specialized, strong in one pattern but less prepared for others, while when repetition is varied, the body may develop a broader form of readiness, one that allows it to handle different demands without needing to prepare for each one separately. And if we return to the early human starting point, the evidence does not allow us to claim one universal schedule, but it does suggest that life was closely tied to environmental rhythms rather than mechanical ones, meaning that movement would naturally vary in timing, intensity, and type. Sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, sometimes slower, sometimes requiring more effort, and this variation created a pattern where the body could not rely on predictability, and so it remained more flexible, not in the sense of stretching alone, but in the sense of being able to shift between different kinds of effort without losing coordination, balance, or stability. And this flexibility may have played a role in maintaining strength, because strength is not only the ability to produce force under known conditions, it is also the ability to organize the body under unfamiliar ones, to adjust when the ground changes, when the load is different, when the path is uncertain, and when the timing is not ideal. And in earlier human environments, these adjustments were not optional. They were part of living within a world that could not be fully controlled. And this stands in contrast to many modern conditions, where routines are often stabilized, days are divided into predictable segments, tasks are repeated in similar forms, and environments are designed to reduce uncertainty. And while this stability brings safety, efficiency, and comfort, it also reduces the range of variation the body must handle. And when variation decreases, the body may become more efficient at specific tasks, but less practiced in responding to unfamiliar ones. And this can make strength feel more fragile, because it depends on maintaining a narrow pattern, rather than being supported by a wide range of experience. And if we connect this back to the origin of human life, we can see that one of the things humans used to do, without naming it as such, was simply live in a way that did not repeat itself too precisely. And this lack of strict routine kept the body from settling into a single form, allowing it to remain adaptable across changing conditions. And perhaps this is one of the quiet lessons hidden inside the question, that strength may not only come from doing the same thing again and again, but from being placed inside a world that asks for small differences each time, differences that the body must answer through continuous adjustment, and in answering those differences, the body remains prepared, not for one task alone, but for many. Just as it was in the earliest human environments, where survival depended not on perfect repetition, but on the ability to respond when the pattern changed. Irregularity also changed the way the body recovered, because in older human life, rest and effort were not always divided into fixed blocks, and this uneven rhythm may have helped maintain strength in a way that is difficult to notice from a modern point of view, where recovery is often imagined as stopping completely after a planned period of exertion, but earlier patterns of living likely involved a more fluid alternation, with harder moments followed by lighter movement, short pauses, slower tasks, and then renewed activity when conditions required it. And this matters because the human body does not only need effort to remain capable, it also needs a rhythm that prevents both overuse and complete disengagement. And a varied life may have provided that rhythm without anyone designing it. If we return to the early human starting point, the body was shaped in landscapes where one day could not simply be copied from another, because rain could soften the ground, heat could slow travel, cold could demand more gathering of fuel, animals could move elsewhere, and food sources could appear, fade, or require different forms of work. Such variation meant that the body was not always pushed in the same direction. It might walk farther on one day, carry more on another, spend more time near a hearth or shelter on another, and then return to movement when the environment shifted again. This kind of irregularity did not guarantee ease, and it could include hardship, hunger, injury, and uncertainty. But it also kept the body from being locked into one narrow pattern of use. The quiet strength that came from this was not the strength of constant maximum effort, but the strength of changing demand, where different tissues, joints, and movements were called upon at different times, allowing the whole body to remain involved across the broader shape of life. This is different from a routine that repeats the same positions for long hours and then asks the body to become active briefly, because a repeated modern pattern can create deep familiarity with inactivity, while ancient irregularity kept activity closer to the surface. We should be careful not to claim that early humans lived in a perfect natural balance, because the evidence does not support such a simple picture, and many ancient conditions were harsh. Yet the broader structure remains useful to understand. The body was usually exposed to varied demands that arose from the world itself, and those demands made physical capability part of adapting to change. Archaeological traces of seasonal movement, changing camps, tool use, resource gathering, and food processing do not preserve the exact rhythm of every day, but they suggest lives organized around conditions that shifted over space and time, and behind those traces were bodies that had to adjust repeatedly rather than follow a fixed plan. In modern life, by contrast, many changes have been softened. Climate control reduces the body's response to temperature. Stored food reduces the urgency of searching. Transportation reduces the physical meaning of distance. Stable work schedules reduce variation in posture and movement. These changes are protective and often necessary, but they also narrow the body's ordinary experience. The body may then become strong only in the places where we deliberately challenge it, while becoming less practiced in the many smaller adjustments that once came from changing days. This brings the question of ancient strength into a more precise focus. Humans may have stayed strong not because every day was harder, but because every day was not identical. The body was asked to recover while still lightly engaged, to shift from one demand to another, to accept pauses without becoming completely passive, and to begin again without needing a formal signal. In that older rhythm, strength was maintained by variation itself, by a world that changed just enough to keep the body listening, from the earliest human landscapes where time, weather, hunger, distance, and social need all moved together in patterns that could never be fully repeated. Irregularity also kept strength connected to attention, because when a person cannot fully predict the next surface, load, distance, or task, the body must remain gently prepared, not tense, not fearful, but awake enough to change direction when the world changes, and this kind of readiness may be one of the quietest forms of ancient strength. It is not the strength of one repeated motion performed perfectly, but the strength of a body that has practiced many incomplete patterns, many small corrections, many returns from awkward positions, and many changes in pace. If we return to the early human starting point, this makes sense, because the first human landscapes were not controlled rooms with fixed tools, flat floors, measured schedules, and repeated pathways. They were changing places, shaped by weather, light, animal movement, plant growth, water levels, group needs, and the slow uncertainty of finding what was necessary. Within such a world, the body did not know in advance exactly how the day would ask to be used. It might need to walk lightly across wet ground, pause near a shelter, lift something from a low position, carry it for a while, set it down, help gather material, rise again, turn around an obstacle, and later move more slowly as light faded. None of these actions alone explains human strength, but together they created a life where the body was repeatedly asked to remain available. This availability is different from constant strain. It is closer to a state of practical readiness, where the body keeps enough strength, balance, and coordination to answer ordinary change. Archaeology cannot show every pause, turn, or uneven step, and it would be wrong to invent exact daily scenes as if all early humans lived the same way. Yet the broad evidence of mobile lives, varied environments, changing resource use, and material work supports the larger idea that human bodies were not shaped by perfect regularity. They were shaped by repeated adjustment. This matters because adjustment uses the whole body in ways that are often invisible. The eyes read distance, the feet search for pressure, the hips and spine organize balance, the hands prepare to catch, hold, or steady. The breath changes with effort. The nervous system keeps comparing what the body expects with what the ground and task actually provide. In such a pattern, strength is not only in muscle, it is in timing, control, and the ability to keep moving without everything being ideal. Modern life has reduced many of these uncertainties. That reduction is understandable and often beneficial. Predictable schedules protect people from chaos. Smooth surfaces reduce falls. Standardized tools reduce waste and injury. Climate control reduces physical stress. But when uncertainty is reduced too far, the body receives fewer invitations to adjust. It may still be active, but often inside narrow, repeated channels. It may become good at sitting in one way, walking on one kind of surface, lifting in one controlled setting, or resting in one supported posture. The older pattern was broader. It asked the body to answer small differences so often that adaptability stayed close to the surface. Even rest belonged to this wider field of response, because a person resting near the ground, near tools, near fire, near changing weather, or near other people's needs was still inside a living situation that could shift. The body was not always working, but it was rarely sealed away from the world that might ask it to move again. This completes the thought of irregularity as one of the forgotten patterns behind ancient strength. Humans did not stay capable because their lives followed a perfect natural program. They stayed capable, in part, because life did not repeat itself exactly enough for the body to become too fixed. The day changed, the ground changed, the load changed, the weather changed, the group's needs changed, and through those changes, from the earliest human environments onward, the body remained in conversation with a world that kept asking it to respond. Rest in earlier human life did not always mean complete stillness, and this difference begins to reveal another quiet layer in the way strength was maintained over time. Because when rest allows the body to disengage entirely, it creates a clear boundary between activity and inactivity, while a form of rest that remains lightly connected to the environment may preserve a different kind of readiness. And if we return to the early human starting point, the conditions of rest were often shaped by the same factors that shaped movement: ground that was not perfectly even, air that changed with temperature and light, sounds that signaled safety or uncertainty, and social spaces where others were nearby, and within such conditions the body may have rested without fully disconnecting, not because it was forced to remain tense, but because the environment did not always support complete passivity for long periods. And this matters because the human body adapts not only to effort, but also to how it rests. And when rest becomes deeply supported, prolonged, and separated from the need to respond, the body can settle into positions that require little engagement, and over time this can reduce the quiet background activity that once kept muscles, joints, and balance systems gently involved even during recovery. And this does not mean that early human rest was better or more comfortable, because it could involve cold, uneven surfaces, limited shelter, and interruptions that made deep recovery more difficult. And it is important not to idealize those conditions, but it does suggest that rest and movement were less sharply divided, and that the body often remained within a spectrum of engagement, where even low activity states still required some degree of organization and awareness. And archaeology cannot show exactly how people rested in every moment, but it does show living areas close to the ground, hearths that required tending, spaces that were shared, and material traces that imply frequent transitions between activity and rest. And within those transitions, the body may have learned to recover without becoming completely inactive. And this is different from many modern patterns, where rest is often designed to remove as much physical demand as possible through soft surfaces, stable positions, controlled temperature, and reduced need to respond to the surrounding world. And these changes are valuable, especially for healing, comfort, and protection from hardship. But they also change the structure of rest, making it more separate from movement and more complete in its disengagement. And when rest becomes more complete, activity may need to become more intentional to compensate, because the body no longer remains lightly engaged across the entire day. And this creates a cycle where strength is built in specific moments and then allowed to fade between them, rather than being quietly maintained through continuous low-level use. And if we connect this back to the origin of human life, we can begin to see that one of the things humans used to do was rest in a way that did not fully remove them from their environment. And within that form of rest, the body remained subtly involved, ready to respond, ready to shift, and ready to return to movement without a sharp transition. And this does not provide a simple method to follow, but it reveals a pattern that once existed, where recovery and activity were part of the same continuum, and where strength did not need to be restored from absence, because it was never completely set aside in the first place. The older form of rest also carried a social dimension, and this matters because a body does not only rest in relation to the ground or the weather, it rests inside a group, near other people, near shared tasks, and near the possibility that someone else's need may gently call it back into use. And if we return to the early human starting point, rest was unlikely to be a private withdrawal from the physical world in the way it often becomes today, because shelter, fire, food preparation, tool handling, childcare, and social awareness were all gathered into spaces where activity and recovery could overlap, and within such spaces a person might pause, sit, watch, listen, adjust posture, help briefly, return to stillness, and then move again without a clear boundary between working and resting. And this kind of rest may have helped maintain strength by preventing the body from falling into long, isolated inactivity, not through pressure or urgency, but through the small interruptions of shared life, where the body remained close to usefulness even when it was not fully active. This is an important point, because modern rest often becomes individual, enclosed, and heavily supported. A person may sit alone for long periods, surrounded by objects that remove the need to rise, reach, carry, turn, or respond. Such rest can be comforting and necessary, especially after fatigue, illness, or stress, but it creates a different physical pattern from rest that remains lightly woven into the movement of others. In older human environments, rest may have been closer to a temporary lowering of intensity than a complete stopping of engagement. Someone resting near a hearth might still shift position as heat changed, move closer or farther, adjust material, respond to a sound, make room for another person, hold something briefly, or rise when a task returned. We should be careful not to invent exact scenes as certainty, because ancient daily life varied widely across climates, cultures, and time. Yet the wider pattern is reasonable. Human beings evolved as social bodies, and much of their rest likely occurred within shared spaces where physical stillness was not sealed away from the needs of the group. Archaeological traces of hearths, living floors, clustered tools, processed materials, and repeated occupation surfaces suggest that many ordinary tasks happened close together, and although they do not preserve every resting body, they remind us that activity, recovery, and social presence were often physically near one another. This nearness may have mattered because strength is easier to preserve when the body is repeatedly invited back into small usefulness. Not forced into heavy labor, not constantly strained, but invited through tiny transitions that keep movement familiar. A hand reaches for an object. A body leans to listen. A person rises to make space. A small item is passed, held, set down, or moved closer. These gestures are not impressive, and they would never be counted as training, yet they keep the body from becoming completely absent from the world around it. In modern life, many of those gestures are reduced because tools are within reach, communication is distant, food is prepared elsewhere, warmth is controlled by systems, and rest can occur in spaces designed for long immobility. Again, this is not a failure. It is part of comfort and protection, but it changes the body's rhythm. Rest becomes more silent, more still, more separated from shared material life. The ancient pattern suggests something different. Humans once rested near the ongoing work of living, and because of that, rest did not always erase readiness. It softened effort, but it did not always remove the body from participation. This helps answer the larger question with more care. What kept humans strong was not only walking, carrying, and working. It was also the way rest itself remained connected to the group, the ground, the fire, the weather, and the next small need, so that the body could recover while still belonging to a world that might gently ask it to move again. Rest also shaped strength through the way it prepared the body to return, because a body that rests in complete separation from movement may need a stronger signal before it becomes active again, while a body that rests inside a living environment can move back into use more gradually, and this softer return may have been one of the quiet patterns that helped ancient humans remain capable. In earlier human life, rest was likely not always arranged as a clean ending to activity. It could be a pause between tasks, a lowering of intensity near a hearth, a seated moment close to tools, a temporary stop during travel, or a shared period of quiet in which the body was still close to ground. Weather, people, and materials. If we return to the early human starting point, this matters because the body was shaped in conditions where survival depended on transitions as much as on effort itself. A person did not only need to move, the body also needed to stop without losing readiness, recover without becoming completely disengaged, and rise again when the world changed. This kind of rest is different from rest that removes almost every physical request. It does not mean ancient people were always alert or never deeply tired. Many older environments could be difficult, cold, exposed, and uncertain, and rest could be broken or uncomfortable. But the important point is structural. Rest often remained connected to a world that was still asking small things of the body. A sleeping or resting place close to the ground required lowering and rising. A shared shelter required shifting and making space. Fire, if present, required attention and material. Weather could change posture. Group life could interrupt stillness. None of these movements alone explained strength, but together they created repeated returns from rest into action, and repeated returns may be a deeply important form of physical maintenance. The body learns what it does often. If it often returns from low positions, it remembers how to rise. If it often shifts during rest, it remembers how to adjust. If it often pauses without becoming completely passive, it keeps some part of its practical readiness close to the surface. Archaeology cannot preserve rest as a complete experience, yet living floors, hearth areas, low workspaces, sleeping traces, and clustered materials suggest that rest and activity often occupied the same physical world, rather than being separated into entirely different zones. That closeness matters. It means recovery did not always require leaving the practical environment behind. By contrast, modern rest often gives the body a very different message. Soft furniture, high beds, controlled temperature, private rooms, screens, and long periods of supported posture can make rest more complete and more comfortable, which is valuable for many reasons, but it can also make the return to movement feel sharper, as if the body is moving from absence back into use, instead of continuing along a gentle spectrum. This may be one reason strength can feel difficult to keep in modern life, because the day often moves between long supported stillness and short intentional effort, rather than between many smaller states of engagement. The older pattern suggests that humans used to rest in ways that kept recovery and readiness closer together. They did not necessarily choose this. It was built into the ground, the shelter, the climate, the group, and the unfinished work of the day. Rest lowered the body's demand, but it did not always remove the body from life. This completes the thought of rest as part of strength, because the old human body was not only kept capable by what it did while active, but by how it paused, how it shifted, how it stayed near the world, and how it returned. From the earliest human landscapes onward, strength may have survived not only through movement, but through a form of rest that never fully taught the body to forget movement. Hunger and scarcity formed another quiet layer in the pattern that kept the human body engaged, not as a constant state of deprivation in every moment, but as a recurring condition that linked movement to need in a way that is less common in modern life. And this connection matters because when food is not immediately available, the body is drawn into the process of finding, gathering, or preparing it. And that process often requires movement across space, attention to environment, and coordination of effort with others. And if we return to the early human starting point, the relationship between hunger and movement was not designed as a method. It emerged from the structure of life in landscapes where resources were distributed unevenly, changing with season, location, and time. And within such conditions, the body did not simply receive energy, it participated in the path toward it. And this participation may have helped maintain strength in a quiet and continuous way, because the act of securing food involved walking, searching, bending, carrying, processing, and returning. And none of these actions needed to be extreme to matter, since their value came from being repeated whenever food was needed. And over long periods, this repetition could keep the body connected to practical effort without separating that effort into a special activity. And it is important to be careful here, because we should not assume that all early human groups experienced hunger in the same way, or that scarcity was constant or identical across different environments, as evidence shows a wide range of conditions, with some groups having more stable access to resources than others, and with periods of abundance as well as periods of difficulty. And yet the broader pattern remains clear enough to observe that food was not always stored, delivered, or immediately accessible, and so the body was often involved in the chain that led from landscape to nourishment, and this involvement shaped how energy and movement were linked, because effort was not something added after eating. It was often part of what made eating possible, and this difference creates a subtle but important contrast with many modern settings, where food is frequently available with little movement required, through storage, transport, and systems that bring it closer to the body, and these changes have protected people from the dangers of hunger and uncertainty, which is a significant achievement, but they also separate the act of eating from the act of moving, and when that separation becomes strong, the body may no longer receive the same repeated signals that once connected energy with effort, and as a result, strength may become something that must be maintained intentionally rather than emerging from the structure of daily life. And if we consider again the earliest human environments, we can see that the body was shaped within a cycle where movement often preceded nourishment. Not always, not in every case, but often enough to form a pattern, and this pattern did not require constant strain, but it did require participation, and participation kept the body involved in the practical work of living. And this brings us back to the central question with another layer of clarity, because one of the things humans used to do, without naming it as such, was move in order to eat. And through that simple connection, the body remained engaged in a way that is easy to overlook when food and movement become separate parts of the day. And within that earlier structure, strength may have been maintained not through effort alone, but through the quiet relationship between hunger, landscape, and the need to act before receiving, a relationship that reaches back to the beginning of human life, when the body and its environment were still closely tied by the simple necessity of finding what was needed to continue. Scarcity also changed the quality of effort because it made the body more attentive to economy. And this is different from the idea that ancient strength came only from harder work, because a body living with uncertain food cannot afford to waste movement endlessly, and so strength had to remain connected to pacing, judgment, patience, and the careful use of energy. This is an important distinction, because the older human body was not simply being pushed all the time, it was likely learning, through repeated necessity, when to move, when to slow down, when to carry, when to wait, when to share effort, and when to conserve. If we return to the early human starting point, food was often part of a wider landscape of decisions. A personal group had to recognize where something might be found, whether the distance was worth crossing, whether a material could be carried back, whether the time of day mattered, whether weather changed the route, and whether effort should be spent now or saved for later. These decisions were not always conscious in the modern analytical sense, and we should not imagine exact thoughts inside ancient minds, but the structure of life itself required the body to act within limits. That may have helped maintain a practical kind of strength, not just strength that can produce force, but strength that can last, adjust, and continue without collapsing too quickly. When food is easy to reach, effort can become separate from nourishment. But when nourishment is uncertain, movement becomes part of a careful balance between spending energy and gaining it back. This balance may have shaped the body in a slower and broader way than intense effort alone. Walking too fast, carrying too much, or choosing a difficult route could matter when food was not guaranteed. Moving too little could also matter, because resources would not come closer by themselves. Between those two pressures, the body lived in a middle zone of repeated moderate effort, where capability was preserved by use, but use was guided by the need not to exhaust the body without reason. Archaeology cannot show every decision about energy, hunger, and movement, but it can show that humans used varied resources, processed food in different ways, transported materials, and occupied changing places over long spans of time. These traces suggest that food was not merely consumed, it was searched for, gathered, prepared, shared, stored when possible, and connected to movement across space. Behind those traces were bodies that had to remain strong enough to act, but careful enough to keep acting. This is where scarcity becomes more than a hardship. It becomes part of the environment that shaped endurance, not by making life better, but by making waste difficult. In modern life, many people are protected from this uncertainty by stored food, supply chains, refrigeration, delivery systems, markets, kitchens, and schedules. These are major human achievements, and they reduce real suffering, but they also change the body's relationship with energy. Food can arrive before movement. Calories can be consumed without the body crossing distance, carrying weight, or handling raw materials. The old chain between hunger and physical participation becomes shorter, and sometimes it almost disappears. When that happens, strength no longer grows out of the practical economy of daily life. It has to be invited back through chosen effort. The older pattern suggests that humans were kept strong, partly because the body had to manage the cost of living in a world where energy was valuable and movement had consequence. Strength was not only the result of doing more, it was also the result of learning, over generations, to move with enough force, enough restraint, and enough persistence to meet need without wasting what the body could not easily replace. This connects directly to the beginning of human life, where hunger, distance, weather, memory of place, and shared effort formed one system. In that system, the body stayed engaged because food was not simply present. It had to be approached, handled, carried, and made usable. And through that long relationship between energy and action, human strength remained tied to the careful rhythm of survival. Scarcity also kept strength connected to cooperation, because the search for food was rarely only an individual matter, and this social side of hunger adds another layer to the question of what humans used to do that kept them strong. A single body could walk, gather, carry, prepare, and return, but human survival has long depended on shared attention and shared effort. Food had to be noticed, reached, handled, divided, protected, cooked or processed when possible, and brought into the life of a group. Each of these steps could involve movement, and each movement had meaning beyond the person performing it. If we return to the early human starting point, the body was not only moving toward nourishment for itself, it was often moving within a social field, where the needs of children, older people, injured people, skilled gatherers, tool makers, and others shaped how labour may have been shared. We should not invent one exact ancient system, because human groups differed across climates, landscapes, and periods of time, but the broader truth is stable enough. People did not survive only as isolated bodies. They survived through cooperation around resources, and that cooperation kept bodies involved in practical tasks. This matters because strength maintained through shared need is different from strength maintained through personal ambition. When food must be found and made usable, effort is repeated not because the body wants improvement, but because the group needs continuity. Someone carries a small load because it matters. Someone walks a familiar route because it connects a place of finding with a place of use. Someone helps process material because raw food or gathered material often cannot simply be consumed as it is. Someone rises from rest because another task has appeared. None of this needs to be heroic. Its power lies in being ordinary. Across many days, ordinary shared tasks keep calling the body back into use, and this repeated calling may have helped preserve strength in ways that were quiet, social, and practical. Archaeological traces cannot preserve the full life of cooperation, yet hearths, living floors, repeated occupation areas, tools, food remains, and transported materials suggest that food and material life were often organized around places where people worked rested, and returned together. These traces remind us that eating was not only a private act of consumption, it was connected to landscape, labour, timing, fire, tools, and social arrangement. In modern life, many of these connections have been shortened. Food is often already selected, transported, stored, cleaned, cut, packaged, cooked, delivered, or placed within easy reach. This is a profound protection from uncertainty, and it should not be dismissed. It reduces suffering, saves time, and supports people who could not safely endure older forms of hardship. But it also means that fewer bodies are needed in the chain between hunger and nourishment. The social work of food becomes hidden inside systems, machines, transport networks, and distant labour. The body receiving food may no longer walk for it, carry it far, process it deeply, or participate in the same shared physical rhythm. When this happens, strength loses one of its old anchors, usefulness to the group. The ancient pattern does not tell us to return to scarcity, and it should never be turned into a false praise of hunger. Hunger could be dangerous, painful, and destructive. The careful lesson is different. It shows that the human body was shaped in a world where energy had to pass through action, and action often passed through cooperation. That relationship kept movement meaningful. It joined walking, carrying, preparing, waiting, sharing, and returning into one chain. So one of the things humans used to do that kept them strong was not simply eat less, or suffer more, or live harder. It was that their bodies often remained inside the shared work of making food possible. From the earliest human landscapes onward, hunger did not only empty the body, it called the body into motion with others, and through that call, strength stayed close to need, close to responsibility, and close to the living circle that made survival possible. Human strength was also shaped by the fact that people rarely lived as isolated bodies, because the human body has always existed inside groups, and groups quietly organize movement in ways that an individual life does not. When a person moves alone, effort can be delayed, avoided, or defined only by personal need. But when life is shared, movement is often called forth by the needs of others, by children who must be carried, older people who must be supported, tools that must be passed, shelter materials that must be gathered, food that must be divided, and spaces that must be arranged so several bodies can live together. This social structure matters because it gives physical effort a repeated reason to return. If we return to the early human starting point, the body was not only a private instrument for survival, it was part of a cooperative pattern, shaped by attention to other people, shared resources, and the practical work of maintaining a group across changing conditions. We should not imagine one fixed ancient community or claim that every group lived in the same way, because human societies have always varied. Yet it is widely accepted that cooperation is central to human evolution, and within that cooperation the body was repeatedly used in tasks that connected one person's strength to another person's safety, comfort, or survival. This makes social life one of the overlooked forces behind ancient strength. A person may walk because others are moving. A person may carry because something is needed at the shared place. A person may rise from rest because a task has appeared nearby. A person may bend, lift, hold, reach, or help not for personal improvement, but because the group's ordinary life requires participation. In this setting, strength is not displayed as an individual possession. It is spent in small amounts through usefulness. The hands become strong because they handle shared materials. The back and hips remain engaged because loads are moved for common purposes. Balance and posture are used because space is shared, uneven, and changing. Even quiet social gestures can carry physical meaning when they happen close to the ground, near tools, fire, food, children, and shelter. Archaeological traces cannot preserve every act of helping, but living floors, hearths, clustered tools, food remains, and repeated occupation areas show that much of human life unfolded in shared spaces where material tasks and social presence overlapped. Behind those traces were bodies that did not simply rest beside other bodies, but entered and left small tasks as the day required. This is very different from many modern arrangements, where social connection can happen without the body moving much at all. A message can travel without walking. Food can be ordered without gathering. Work can be coordinated without shared physical presence. Care can sometimes be organized through systems that reduce direct bodily effort. These changes can be humane and necessary, especially across distance, illness, disability, or age. But they also alter the way social life uses the body. When the group no longer needs the body's repeated participation in ordinary material tasks, strength loses one of the old pathways by which it was maintained without deliberate training. The older pattern suggests that humans stayed capable, partly because their bodies were needed by others in practical ways, not constantly and not equally, but often enough for movement to remain woven into belonging. This is a careful point, because it should not romanticize hardship or pretend that ancient cooperation was always gentle. Shared life could include conflict, pressure, and unequal burdens. Still, the broader pattern remains important. In the beginning of human life, strength was often social before it was personal. It was connected to carrying what others needed, moving where others moved, making space, sharing work, and answering small demands that rose from the group itself. Through those ordinary exchanges, the body remained useful, and because it remained useful, it remained engaged. Shared physical life also shaped strength through the way generations lived near one another, because a human group was never made of one age alone, and the presence of children, adults, older people, and injured or tired bodies created a constant exchange of movement, support, learning, and adjustment. This matters because strength in earlier human life was not only maintained by large tasks, but also by the small demands created when different bodies needed different things at the same time. A child might need to be lifted, guided, carried, watched or followed. An older person might move more slowly, requiring the group to change pace or redistribute tasks. A skilled adult might carry knowledge rather than the heaviest load, while another person might handle more physical work for a time. We should not invent a single ancient family scene as if it were universal, but it is reasonable to say that human life has long depended on age, diversity, care, and cooperation, and those relationships kept the body active in ways that were not always dramatic. If we return to the early human starting point, the body did not grow strong in isolation from life stages. It grew strong within a social field, where young bodies learned movement by watching and joining. Mature bodies carried much of the practical burden, and aging bodies still remained near the flow of activity whenever possible. This created a different kind of physical continuity across generations. Strength was not only something one person possessed, it was passed through habits, gestures, and repeated tasks. A child learned how to step over uneven ground, how to squat near a fire, how to hold an object, how to follow a path, how to wait, how to carry something small, and how to rise again after sitting near the earth. These were not formal lessons. They were the ordinary movements of belonging. Archaeology cannot preserve the full teaching of the body, but repeated occupation areas, tools of different kinds, hearths, food remains, and living surfaces suggest spaces where skills, materials, and daily routines were shared. In such spaces, the body learned by participation, and participation kept movement alive before it became a separate concern. This is a major contrast with many modern lives, where generations are often separated by institutions, work schedules, age-specific spaces, screens, transport, and specialized care systems. These changes can bring safety, education, medical support, and relief from burdens that were once extremely difficult. Yet they also change the way movement passes from one body to another. Children may learn movement in controlled settings rather than through constant outdoor participation. Adults may perform work that uses attention more than the whole body. Older people may be protected from risk, but also more easily removed from everyday physical participation. When the generations become more separated, the old chain of bodily imitation and shared usefulness becomes weaker. The body then learns less from the visible rhythm of other bodies moving through practical tasks. This does not mean the past was kinder to every age. It often was not. Infancy was vulnerable, injury could be serious, and old age could be physically demanding. But inside the larger question of what kept humans strong, the generational structure of life matters because strength was surrounded by examples, needs, and small invitations to participate. The young saw movement before they understood it. Adults used strength because others depended on it. Older bodies remained part of the memory of how tasks were done. And between these ages, the body was repeatedly asked to adjust its force, soften its pace, carry differently, wait longer, move again, and stay useful without becoming separate from care. From the earliest human landscapes onward, strength was not kept only in muscle. It was kept in repeated social patterns, in care, imitation, shared pace, and the quiet transfer of movement from one generation to the next. Shared physical life also kept strength close to rhythm, because a group does not move like a machine, and the body inside a group must constantly adjust to the pace, needs, limits, and timing of others. This kind of adjustment is easy to overlook, yet it may have been one of the quieter ways human bodies remained capable across long periods of time. When people move together, no single body controls the whole pattern. Someone slows, someone waits, someone carries more for a while, someone changes direction, someone notices a need that others have not seen, someone rests, and the group's movement bends around that pause. In early human life, this kind of shared rhythm may have mattered because survival often depended not only on individual endurance, but on keeping the group moving, resting, gathering, carrying, and returning in a way that allowed different bodies to remain part of the whole. We should not describe all ancient groups as harmonious or perfectly cooperative, because human groups have always included tension, conflict, and unequal effort. Yet the broader pattern remains important. The human body evolved in social conditions, and those conditions repeatedly placed physical capability inside relationships. If we return to the early human starting point, strength was not simply the ability to move ahead alone, it was also the ability to match pace, carry when needed, wait without fully disengaging, help without overextending, and continue as part of a living group. This shaped movement differently from isolated effort. A person moving alone may choose the most efficient pace for the self. A person moving with others may need to speed up, slow down, pause, turn back, share a load, make room, or change posture according to the situation. Each adjustment may be small, but together they keep the body responsive. They also keep strength from becoming purely individual. It becomes relational, connected to timing, attention, and the ability to remain useful within a shifting social field. Archaeological traces cannot show every shared movement, but they do show repeated places of gathering, working, resting, food processing, tool-making, and fire use. These spaces suggest that many practical activities were not isolated events, but shared arrangements of bodies, materials, and time. Within those arrangements, strength was likely used in many modest ways, lifting something together, moving material toward a common place, preparing food near others, maintaining shelter, watching children, supporting slower movement, or returning to a task after a pause. None of these acts needs to be dramatic. Their importance lies in repetition. When repeated across days and generations, shared physical life gives the body many reasons to remain engaged, and those reasons do not depend only on personal desire. In modern life, social connection often remains strong, but it can be physically lighter. People can communicate across distance, coordinate work without meeting, receive food and goods through systems, and live in spaces where each person's body is less often required by the immediate group. This is a remarkable achievement, and it protects people from many old burdens, but it also means that belonging may no longer carry the same amount of physical participation. The group can continue even when the body stays still. The older pattern was different. To belong often meant being physically present in the shared work of living, near the ground, near tools, near food, near shelter, near children, near those who needed help, and near tasks that did not finish themselves. This completes the social layer of ancient strength. Humans were not kept strong only by walking farther, carrying weight, resting differently, or living in changing environments. They were also kept strong because other people quietly called the body back into use. The call was not always spoken. It could come from a child needing support, a shared object needing movement, a fire needing fuel, a route needing company, or a common place needing care. From the earliest human landscapes onward, strength remained close to belonging, because the body was not only responsible for itself, it was part of a group, and the group gave movement a reason to return. Aging in an older physical world was not simply the passage of years through the body, but the passage of years through an environment that continued to ask for movement. And this difference matters because the body does not age in empty space. It ages inside the habits, surfaces, distances, and social needs that surround it. In many modern settings, growing older can gradually mean being protected from more and more physical demands, sometimes for good reasons, because comfort, safety, medicine, and support can reduce pain, risk, and exhaustion. Yet if we look back toward earlier human life, without pretending it was gentle or ideal, we can see a different structure. A person who lived long enough to become older was still likely near the ground, near shared tasks, near weather, near tools, near food preparation, near children, near walking routes, and near the ordinary movement of the group. This did not mean that older bodies carried the same burdens as younger adults. Human life has always included changing capacity, and age can bring slower movement, reduced strength, injury, pain, and the need for help. But the important point is that aging did not automatically remove a body from the physical world. The old body may have moved differently, more slowly, with more care, or with lighter tasks, yet it could still remain inside a field of use. That field may have helped preserve capability, because what the body continues to do, it tends to remember. If a person keeps rising from low positions, the body remembers rising. If a person keeps walking short distances over natural ground, the body remembers balance. If a person keeps handling objects, tending small tasks, sitting near others, shifting posture, and returning to movement after rest, the body remains connected to the practical language of motion. This is not a claim that ancient aging was easier. It was often harder. Injury, disease, tooth loss, hunger, and exposure could make later life fragile. Many people did not reach old age, and those who did were not protected by modern care. The careful lesson is more specific. When older humans remained part of shared physical life, strength may have been maintained not as youthfulness but as continued participation. Archaeological evidence cannot tell us every detail of how old people moved, but the presence of individuals who survived injuries or long-term physical difficulty in some ancient populations suggests that care and social support were part of human life across deep time. This matters because support does not always mean removing all effort. In a group-based life, support could allow someone to remain involved at a level that matched their capacity. An older person might carry knowledge, watch children, help prepare materials, tend fire, sort food, repair objects, guide memory of places, or move slowly with the group. Some of these tasks were physical in modest ways, and modest physical use can still matter. The body may not need heavy strain to preserve a sense of function. It may need repeated invitations to stay involved. In modern life, protection can sometimes become separation. An older person may be seated longer, transported more often, served more directly, and removed from tasks that once required small acts of usefulness. This can be kind and necessary in many cases, especially where pain or illness is real. But when all demand disappears, the body receives fewer reminders of what it can still do. From the earliest human landscapes onward, aging likely unfolded inside movement, not outside it. And one of the forgotten patterns that kept humans strong was that the body, even as it changed with age, was often still asked to belong physically to the living world around it. The aging body also reveals that strength is not only the amount of force a person can produce, but the ability to keep a meaningful place inside movement as capacity changes. And this idea helps us see ancient physical life with more care, because older humans were not simply weaker versions of younger humans, they were bodies carrying memory, experience, caution, timing, and social value, and these qualities may have shaped how strength was used across a lifetime. In the early human starting point, survival depended not only on speed or heavy effort, but on knowing where to go, when to move, how to recognize useful materials, how to read weather, how to prepare food, how to remember paths, how to avoid waste, and how to help younger bodies learn what the landscape required. These forms of knowledge were not separate from the body. They lived in gestures, pace, posture, touch, and repeated practical action. An older person might move more slowly, but slower movement can still be active movement. A lighter task can still maintain coordination. A shorter walk can still preserve balance. A seated task near the ground can still require shifting, reaching, gripping, sorting, and rising again. This is why aging in an older physical context cannot be understood only as decline. It was also a change in how the body remained useful. We should be careful not to idealize this, because many ancient people faced pain, injury, infection, food uncertainty, and harsh conditions with far less protection than people have today. Yet the broader pattern is still worth seeing. When life remains physically shared, reduced capacity does not always mean complete removal from use. The body can continue to participate through smaller, slower, more careful forms of effort. This may have helped preserve strength as a living capacity rather than a lost possession. Archaeological evidence cannot tell us the full daily role of every older person, but some ancient remains show individuals who survived serious injury or long-term physical limitation, suggesting that care and social support were not modern inventions alone. Such support matters because it means a person did not have to be either fully capable or completely excluded. There could be a middle space, where the body was helped, but still involved. That middle space is important for understanding what kept humans strong. A body that is never asked to do anything may forget quickly. A body that is asked too much may be harmed. But a body that is asked carefully, repeatedly, and within its changing limits may keep more of its practical ability than expected. In modern life, this middle space can sometimes become harder to maintain, not because people care less, but because systems often divide bodies into categories: active or inactive, independent or dependent, working or retired, fit or frail. Older bodies may be protected by removing tasks, raising surfaces, shortening distances, delivering objects, and replacing shared work with services. These protections can be necessary and humane. They reduce suffering, but they can also unintentionally reduce the ordinary physical invitations that once helped the aging body remain connected to its own abilities. The older pattern suggests something quieter. Across much of human history, aging bodies may have remained near movement because life still had places for smaller effort, slower pace, watchful presence, and practical memory. Strength, then, was not held only by the young. It moved through the group in different forms. Younger bodies carried heavier loads, mature bodies took on repeated work. Older bodies may have carried knowledge, rhythm, caution, care, and modest tasks that still kept them physically present. From the earliest human landscapes onward, strength was not a single peak reached and then lost. It was a changing relationship between body, age, environment, and usefulness, where even a slower body could remain part of the motion of life. Aging in an older physical context also shows why strength was once preserved through continuity rather than recovery from absence, because a body that keeps participating in small ways across many years does not have to restart its relationship with movement each time, and this continuity may be one of the most important differences between ancient patterns and many modern ones. In the earliest human landscapes, the body moved through age while still surrounded by ground, tools, food, weather, children, shared spaces, and the unfinished tasks of daily life. A person who became older did not necessarily move with the same speed or force as before, and it would be false to pretend that age did not reduce capacity. Bones, joints, teeth, muscles, vision, hearing, and recovery all change with time, and ancient people faced these changes without many protections that exist today. Yet the body's decline did not always mean total withdrawal from the physical world. A slower body could still shift position, sit low, rise carefully, hold a small object, prepare material, watch over younger people, walk shorter routes, tend a place, or help with a task that required patience more than force. These small movements mattered because they kept the body inside the ordinary rhythm of use. Strength, in this sense, was not preserved by refusing age. It was preserved by not cutting the aging body completely away from movement. This is a careful but important point. The old world could be harsh, and many lives were shortened by danger, disease, childbirth, infection, injury, or food uncertainty. Nothing about that should be softened into romance. But among those who did live longer, physical life may have remained more continuous than it often becomes today, because the environment still asked for some participation, and the group still contained roles that could change with age. Archaeological traces of long-term survival after injury in some ancient individuals suggest that humans have cared for dependent or limited bodies across deep time, and care itself may have allowed continued participation rather than only passive survival. A supported person might still contribute in smaller ways. A slower person might still hold memory of routes, seasons, materials, and tasks. A body with less force might still remain familiar with balance, touch, posture, and timing. In modern life, by contrast, aging is often managed through comfort and safety, and these are real achievements. Chairs reduce strain, beds make rest easier, transport shortens distance, medical care protects fragile bodies, services can spare older people from exhausting work. Yet the same protections can sometimes remove almost every small physical request, until the body is treated as something to be preserved by stillness rather than sustained through careful use. When that happens, strength can fade not only because of age, but because the world stops asking the aging body to remain part of its own maintenance. The older pattern suggests that humans used to age inside a more physical social world, where movement was reduced, adjusted, and shared, but not always erased. This completes the thought of aging in a different physical context. What kept humans strong was not that they avoided aging, and not that ancient life was healthier or easier. It was that the body, across the life course, was often kept closer to the ground, closer to tasks, closer to other people, and closer to the slow demands that maintain practical ability. From the beginning of human life, strength was never only a young person's possession. It was a changing conversation between the body and the world, and as long as that conversation continued, even quietly, the body still had reasons to remember what it could do. The disappearance of the old patterns did not happen all at once, and this is why it is so difficult to notice, because human strength was not taken away by one invention, one settlement, one tool, or one change in behavior, but was gradually loosened from daily life, as the conditions that once required constant physical participation became softer, shorter, and more predictable. When people began living more permanently in certain places, growing food, storing resources, shaping buildings, organizing labor, and changing their relationship with land, the body did not suddenly stop moving. In many cases, settled life could be physically demanding, involving digging, carrying, grinding, building, harvesting, tending animals, walking, repairing, and enduring long days of repeated work. It would be inaccurate to imagine that early farming or village life immediately made humans inactive. The change was more subtle. Movement became tied to new forms of work, often more repetitive, more localized, and more dependent on fixed places. Instead of the body moving through wide, shifting landscapes in search of scattered resources, more of life became centered around fields, stored food, houses, tools, paths, and seasonal labor. This did not remove effort, but it began to reorganize it. If we return to the early human starting point, strength had once been maintained through varied contact with terrain, distance, carrying, changing weather, ground-level living, and social movement across space. In settled life, some of those older demands remained, but others began to narrow. The body still worked, but the world around it was slowly being arranged to hold things in place. Food could be stored, water could sometimes be brought closer, shelter became more durable, tools became more specialized, paths became more familiar, tasks repeated in similar spaces. These changes were major human achievements, and they helped protect communities from some dangers of uncertainty, but they also changed the background rhythm that had once kept strength distributed across many kinds of movement. Archaeological evidence from the long transition into agriculture and settled communities shows that human life became more organized around specific places, cultivated plants, domesticated animals in some regions, built environments, and stored materials. The exact timing and effects differed across the world, and no single story can describe every population. Some groups remained mobile, some mixed farming with foraging, some developed complex settlements, and some lived in ways that shifted with season and environment. But across many regions, a broad change did occur. Humans increasingly shaped their surroundings to reduce certain uncertainties. This was not weakness. It was intelligence, memory, cooperation, and survival expressed through culture. Yet when a species begins to change its environment, the environment also changes what the body is asked to do. The ground may become more level, work may happen near the same dwelling, repeated tasks may replace varied movement, stored grain may reduce the need to travel for every meal, while also creating new labor around processing and protection. Strength remains, but it begins to be maintained by different demands. This is where the slow disappearance begins. Not in total comfort, but in reorganization. The body is still useful, but useful in narrower, more repeated ways. The old mixture of walking, carrying, climbing, searching, balancing, rising from the ground, responding to weather, and moving with the group does not vanish immediately. It fades unevenly over centuries and regions as human life becomes more built, more stored, more scheduled, and more controlled. In modern life, this process has gone much further, but its roots are older than factories and screens. The first quiet step was the human ability to make the world more predictable. That predictability saved lives and built civilizations, yet it also began to reduce the natural variety that once kept the body strong without intention. The old patterns did not disappear because humans became lazy. They disappeared because humans became extraordinarily good at solving the problems that had once required the body to stay constantly engaged. As human societies became more built and organized, another change slowly appeared. Strength began to separate from ordinary survival and attach itself to specific kinds of labor, and this separation matters because once movement becomes specialized, the body may remain hard-working in one way while losing contact with many other forms of use. In earlier mobile or mixed lifeways, physical demand often came from many directions at once: walking across uneven ground, carrying irregular loads, shifting rest positions, responding to weather, gathering scattered materials, and moving with a group whose needs changed through the day. But as settlements, crafts, agriculture, trade, and social roles became more complex, many people began repeating narrower patterns of movement for longer periods. Some bodies worked intensely in fields, some shaped tools, some processed grain, some built, hauled, cooked, repaired, guarded, traded, or carried goods along known routes. These forms of labor could be extremely demanding, and it would be false to say that settled or historical people were physically inactive. Many were likely burdened by repetitive strain, fatigue, hard seasonal work, and limited recovery. Yet the deeper shift was not from strength to weakness. It was from broad environmental movement to more specialized forms of effort. If we return to the early human starting point, the body had once been kept strong by variety as much as by work itself. It had to change surfaces, change direction, change posture, change pace, and change tasks according to a world that was still partly outside human control. In more organized societies, humans increasingly placed tasks inside built systems. A path became a road, a shelter became a house, a gathering place became a village or town, a repeated task became an occupation, a tool became designed for one function, a body became associated with a role. This did not remove effort, but it changed its range. The hand might become skilled in one craft while the legs walked less through wild terrain. The back might become strong from repeated bending while the hips used fewer resting positions. The shoulders might carry heavy loads while balance was challenged less by natural ground. The body could still be powerful, but sometimes in narrower ways, shaped by work that repeated rather than by life that varied. Archaeological and historical evidence shows wide differences across societies, and we should not turn this into one simple story. Past farmers, herders, builders, sailors, craftspeople, soldiers, traders, and laborers lived under very different conditions. Some moved constantly. Some endured heavy work. Some were weakened by poor diet, disease, or social inequality. Some developed great practical strength through labor. But across the long movement toward organized civilization, one pattern becomes important for this video. Human environments increasingly carried more of the burden that the body once had to negotiate directly. Storage reduced immediate searching. Roads reduced uncertain travel. Tools increased efficiency. Buildings controlled space. Work roles divided tasks among people. Markets and trade moved resources through systems larger than the individual body. These changes created civilization, but they also began to hide the older methods inside structures. The body no longer had to do every kind of movement every day. It could become very useful in one repeated pattern while other capacities became less necessary. This is one reason the loss of ancient strength is so hard to describe. It was not a simple decline, it was a narrowing. Humans gained security, skill, surplus, shelter, memory, and culture. At the same time, the wide physical conversation between body and landscape became more selective. Strength remained, but it was increasingly shaped by social role, workplace, class, technology, and access to resources, rather than by the shared demands of a less controlled environment. From the earliest human landscapes to the first complex societies, the body did not stop being strong. It began to be strong in fewer directions, and that quiet narrowing was one of the slow ways the older patterns faded from everyday life. The final stage of this slow disappearance becomes clearer when we look at how modern environments complete the separation between the body and many of the demands that once shaped it. Because what earlier changes began, industrial systems, machines, transport networks, and digital life, have carried much further, not by removing effort entirely, but by relocating it outside the everyday reach of the individual body. And this relocation is important because it means that many of the movements that once maintained strength are still happening in the world, but they are no longer being performed by most people in their daily lives. If we return once more to the earliest human starting point, the body was part of nearly every stage of survival, from searching to gathering, from carrying to preparing, from building to repairing, from resting to rising again, and this closeness meant that strength was used often enough to remain familiar. But as human societies developed tools, engines, infrastructure, and global systems, these stages became distributed across distance, handled by machines, organized through labor systems, or hidden behind layers of convenience, so that a person could live a full day without needing to cross much ground, carry much weight, change posture frequently, or respond to the environment in the same continuous way. And this does not mean that modern life lacks effort, because many people still work physically demanding jobs, and many others face different forms of stress and fatigue. But it does mean that for a large portion of daily life, the body is no longer required in the same integrated, varied, and continuous way that once defined human existence. This change is visible in small details that accumulate over time, surfaces that are flat and predictable, distances that are shortened by vehicles, objects that are designed to be light and easy to handle, food that arrives prepared, work that is performed while seated, communication that travels without movement, and rest that is supported in ways that reduce the need for adjustment. And each of these changes is useful, often necessary, and often a sign of human progress, yet together they create an environment where the body can remain inactive for long periods without immediate consequence. And when that becomes normal, the older patterns of strength begin to fade not because they are rejected, but because they are no longer required. Archaeological and historical evidence show that this process did not begin recently, but the modern era has made it more complete, as technology and organization have reached a level where many needs can be met without direct physical participation, and this creates a new condition in human history, where strength is no longer an automatic byproduct of living, but something that must be chosen, planned, and maintained deliberately, often in environments separate from daily tasks such as structured exercise, controlled routines, or intentional practices that attempt to replace what has been lost. And this shift brings the central question of the video into its final stage, because it shows that humans did not simply forget what to do, they no longer live in conditions that quietly require those actions, and as a result the methods, habits, and patterns that once kept the body strong have become hidden, not lost entirely, but separated from ordinary life and placed into specific moments, activities, or knowledge that must be rediscovered rather than inherited through living. This does not make modern life inferior, because it has brought safety, longevity, and possibilities that were once unimaginable, but it does mean that the relationship between body and environment has changed in a fundamental way, and that strength, once woven into the structure of existence, now exists alongside it as something that must be remembered. And in that remembering, a final question begins to form, not about returning to the past, but about recognizing what remains within the body itself, traces of an older pattern that may still be present, waiting quietly beneath the surface of a world that no longer asks for it in the same way. What remains after the old patterns fade is not a simple instruction, and it is not a promise that the past can be recovered, but a quieter recognition that the human body still carries the shape of a world it no longer fully lives inside. The body still has feet made for crossing ground, hands made for holding and shaping, hips and knees made for lowering and rising, balance systems made for uneven surfaces, muscles that respond to repeated use, bones that respond to loading, and a nervous system that learns through small adjustments repeated over time. These are not romantic ideas. They are ordinary biological facts. The question is, what happens when those capacities remain within us? While the daily world around us no longer asks for them very often, if we return to the earliest human starting point, the body was not designed in isolation from life. It was shaped through movement tied to need, through walking toward water, carrying what mattered, resting near the ground, responding to weather, sharing work with others, and adjusting to days that did not repeat themselves exactly. None of these should be treated as magical ancient methods. They were conditions. They belonged to a world where strength stayed close to use. What remains today is the same body, but surrounded by a different arrangement of space, time, comfort, and support. This means the old patterns have not disappeared from biology. They have disappeared from ordinary expectation. The body can still respond to movement, but movement is no longer woven into every need. The body can still become stronger through carrying, but fewer objects must be carried by hand. The body can still adjust to ground, but most ground has been flattened. The body can still rise from low places, but many places have been lifted for comfort. The body can still recover while lightly engaged, but rest is often designed to remove almost every demand. This is where the final movement of the video must be careful. The lesson is not that ancient life was better. It was often dangerous, painful, uncertain, and shorter for many people. Nor is the lesson that modern comfort is wrong. Comfort has saved lives, reduced suffering, protected older bodies, supported injured people, and made human life less brutal. The useful lesson is more modest and more honest. Strength once belonged to the structure of living, and now it often has to be remembered. That remembering does not require inventing a perfect past. It begins by noticing the kinds of actions that human bodies used to meet naturally. Actions that were humble, repeated, practical, and spread across time. Walking was not only transportation, carrying was not only labour, rest was not only stopping, social life was not only conversation, aging was not only withdrawal. Each of these had a physical dimension that helped keep the body involved in the world. When those dimensions fade, the body does not become broken. It adapts to what remains. And if what remains is long stillness, narrow movement, light contact with the ground, and effort concentrated into short chosen moments, then the body adapts to that too. This may be the coldest truth inside the question. The body is loyal to the life it is given. It does not preserve unused capacity out of memory or nostalgia. It keeps what is asked of it often enough, and it lets go of what the world no longer requires. From the beginning of human life, strength was never separate from environment, need, responsibility, and repetition. It was not a hidden secret. It was the quiet result of being used in many small ways before stillness could become complete. What remains now is the possibility of seeing that pattern without worshipping it, and of understanding that the body's older abilities have not vanished entirely. They are still there as tendencies, responses, and unfinished conversations with ground, weight, distance, rhythm, and other people. The question is not whether we can become ancient again. We cannot. The quieter question is whether a modern body can still hear the older requests written into it, even when the modern world has grown skilled at no longer asking them. If something of the older pattern still remains within the body, it does not remain as a clear set of instructions, and it does not appear as a memory that can be easily recalled, but as a quiet tendency to respond when certain kinds of movement return. And this is where the idea of forgotten methods must be handled with care, because what ancient humans did was rarely organized into methods at all, and yet the body still recognizes certain patterns when they appear. not as knowledge in words, but as a form of familiarity, a sense that something is not entirely new, even if it has been absent for a long time. If we return again to the early human starting point, movement was not separated from meaning, and this may be why the body responds differently to actions that carry purpose compared to actions that are performed only for themselves, because in the older structure, walking was connected to reaching something, carrying was connected to bringing something back, resting was connected to staying within the world, and effort was connected to continuation of life, and these connections shaped how the body organized itself around movement, not through intensity alone, but through repetition that had direction and consequence. And when such patterns appear again, even in a different context, the body may adapt more easily because it is being asked to do something it was shaped to do, not in exactly the same way, but in a way that shares certain qualities, such as moving across space, handling weight, changing levels, adjusting posture, or returning to movement after rest. This does not mean that modern life can recreate the past, and it would be misleading to suggest that any simple set of actions can replace the full environment that once maintained human strength, because that environment included uncertainty, variation, social structure, material life, and long histories that cannot be compressed into a routine. Yet the recognition still matters, because it changes how we understand the body, from something that must be forced into strength, into something that responds when it is placed back into patterns it once knew in a broader sense, and this recognition can be seen not in dramatic transformation, but in small changes in how movement feels when it becomes less isolated, when it is connected to space, to objects, to other people, or to the flow of the day. And although we should not claim certainty about ancient experiences beyond what evidence supports, we can observe that human biology still carries the capacity for walking, carrying, balancing, rising, and adjusting in ways that do not require extreme intensity to be meaningful, and that these capacities often respond to repetition more than to brief effort, and to continuity more than to interruption. And this may explain why certain forms of movement feel more sustainable when they are integrated into life rather than placed at its edges. And yet this is not a prescription, because the modern world cannot simply be undone, and many of its structures are necessary for safety, health, and stability. But it is an observation that the body has not completely lost its older tendencies. It has simply adapted to a different set of demands, and if those demands change even slightly, the body can respond, not because it remembers the past in detail, but because it still belongs to a species that was shaped by those older conditions. And this brings the question to a quieter point, not about rediscovering exact ancient habits, but about noticing how the body reacts when movement becomes less isolated and more connected again, even in small ways, and whether that response suggests that something of the older pattern is still present beneath the surface of modern life, not as a fixed guide, but as a direction the body can still recognize when it appears. At the end of this long path, the answer is not that ancient humans possessed a secret that modern people have forgotten in a simple way, because the older world did not hand them a method, a rule, or a perfect design for strength. It gave them conditions. It gave them distance before food, ground before comfort, weight before convenience, weather before control, shared need before private choice, and repeated movement before long stillness. The body answered those conditions because it had to, and across generations the answering became part of what human bodies were. This is the quieter truth behind the old patterns. Strength was not only built by doing difficult things, it was preserved because useful movement kept returning. A person walked because places were apart. A person carried because objects had to move. A person lowered toward the ground because life happened there. A person rose again because the day was not finished. A person rested without leaving the world entirely, because fire, tools, children, weather, and other bodies remained close. A person aged inside a group that could adjust the kind of work, but did not always remove the body from participation. None of this makes the past gentle. It was not gentle. Many people suffered from hunger, injury, disease, exposure, pain, and uncertainty. Many lives were shorter than we would wish. The purpose of looking back is not to praise hardship, but to understand structure. A hard life is not automatically a healthy life, and a comfortable life is not automatically an empty one. The lesson is more careful than that. Human strength once lived inside the ordinary arrangement of survival, and as that arrangement changed, strength slowly moved from the center of life to the edge of life, where it now often has to be chosen, protected, rebuilt, and remembered. This is why the old habits matter without becoming rules. Walking, carrying, bending, rising, balancing, sharing work, resting near the world, and staying useful across age were not magical practices. They were humble contacts between body and environment. They were ways the body remained in conversation with what surrounded it. Modern life has quieted much of that conversation. Roads, chairs, beds, machines, delivery systems, screens, stored food, climate control, and specialized work have reduced many old demands. These changes have also brought safety, medicine, shelter, time, education, and relief from burdens that once crushed people. The honest view must hold both truths together. We gained protection, and we lost certain forms of daily physical contact. We gained comfort, and we reduced many chances for the body to remember its older range. We gained control, and we softened the world that once kept the body alert through use. So the value of this history is not a command to return. There is no return. The landscapes, societies, tools, risks, and lifespans of early humans cannot be copied, and they should not be copied. What can remain is awareness. The body still listens to repetition. It still responds to weight, ground, distance, balance, posture, social purpose, and steady use. It still changes according to what the day asks from it. If the day asks almost nothing, the body adapts to that quiet request. If the day asks in small, regular, meaningful ways, the body answers those as well. That may be the most useful message of the whole journey. The human body is not separate from the life around it. It is shaped by the spaces it moves through, the objects it handles, the positions it returns to, the people it helps, and the forms of rest it learns. Ancient humans stayed strong not because they solved strength, but because life kept asking the question through their bodies again and again. And if modern life has become skilled at no longer asking, what quiet question is still waiting inside the body, beneath comfort, beneath stillness, beneath everything that no longer needs to be carried?